Fish-like creatures on paws run through the ruins of the building. A foot in a yellow sneaker steps into a puddle. A guy with a huge book on his back runs from monsters and breathes loudly. The creatures approach the hero and growl. The victim's gaze is fixed on the pursuers. The monster looks at its prey and makes menacing sounds. A creature with a toothy mouth is trying to devour its victim. The first monster falls, followed by the rest. The building begins to shake and the hero can barely stay on his feet. He looks at the fallen monsters and does not understand what they are. Monsters fall out of the building and fly down. The guy in the orange hat watches this in horror. A tentacle flew out from below. The tentacle wrapped itself around the guy's leg. There was an expression of horror on the hero's face. The guy was hanging above the ground, having lost his book and hat. The world around him began to disappear and he did not understand what had happened. The hero's eye conveyed all his fear. The young man woke up in a chair. He noticed that he had an earphone in his ear. People in yellow raincoats were examining the area around the bus. The hero pulled back the curtain and looked out the window. The guy looked at his reflection in the wet glass and tried to catch his breath. The bus stood in a dark forest. It was raining heavily. An island was visible in the distance. The hand held the phone with the flashlight on. People in raincoats walked through the forest path and lit the way with their phones. The voice of an adult warned people to take care of their arms and legs, and then asked if someone had been left behind. The voice said that he would arrive soon, so we should try our best. The hero thought that now it was raining and fog with a thunderstorm. Precipitation up to 60 kilometers per hour. The guy's sneaker stepped into a puddle. He thought that all his shoes were wet. The guy looked at his feet irritably. This was his first school trip. Something caught his attention. The boy looked at his reflection in the puddle and realized that this trip was not the most successful. A quiet anxiety grew inside him with every step, like rainwater falling back into the sky. The water from the puddle scattered in all directions from the hero's step. The feeling of anxiety did not leave him. Someone's hand stopped the guy. A woman's voice called him by name, Jang Sehem. The hero leaned back, and the girl standing next to him looked at him irritably. She said they told her to tread carefully. The girl's name was Kim Dasam. The guy and girl looked at the bottom of the cliff while the people behind continued to walk. Dasam asked if the guy was walking alone, like her. She added that she would like to take their excursion a little further. The loner held her hands on the straps of her briefcase, and Sehem looked at her nervously. The guy told her not to scare him like that. The girl asked who else would take care of him if not her. Someone was hit in the stomach. The offender called his victim a worm and ordered him not to be such a bore. The victim was kneeling in the mud. The offender ordered to stand up. The rest watched as the guy was beaten. Then the villain asked what people were staring at, and then shouted at them to mind their own business. The hero looked at what was happening with fear, and his girlfriend relaxed and closed her eyes. The guy said how terrible this bully is. The girl asked if he was talking about Ma Dong-chol. She put her hand forward and told Sehem to trust her. The bully looked at the guy wiping his tears. Dasam told her friend that no one cared about him. The hero was interested in how their relationship would develop in the second year. The bully stood with his hands in his pockets and looked at his victim. To the heroes, everything that happened seemed like a pity. The guy's face showed fear of the scoundrel. Kim Dasam said that she doesn't know the answer to Jang Sehem's question. But nothing can be done, so there's no need to worry. The hero's foot stood in a puddle. The friend said that it was just a school trip and suggested that we not cause any incidents. The guy stood there, unable to tolerate such outrage. He looked at the ground and thought. He took out his phone and asked if he should leave everything like this. The bully raised the face of his victim, who was not looking at him. Dongchul called him by name, Kaijong, and asked where he was looking. He ordered the guy to get ready. The bully hit Kijong and said that he decided to contradict him. The children turned away from what was happening. The light of the screen hit the hero in the face. The guy was doing something on his phone. He nervously looked at the screen and thought that although he was infuriated by the whole situation with the school trip, the school reported that due to weather conditions the buses were delayed and there was nothing they could do. The hero filmed the bullying on camera. Sehem thought that there was nothing he could do to help the boy, but injustice could not be tolerated. He asked himself if he could feel more comfortable if he did nothing. He didn't know the answer. The guy raised his head and looked at the dark sky. He was shaking to the point of trembling and he could not stay away. He decided he would show him. The hero decided that if someone does not support him, then they are just pathetic cowards who only know how to remain silent and toe the line. Sehem called himself a fair man. Dasam looked at the hero with fear. She pulled her hand towards the boy's back. The girl put her hand on the shoulder of her friend, who looked at it in fear. She called his name. Kim Dasam forcibly turned the guy around. She asked what he was doing and he told her to wait. The heroes left, leaving Kijong. Dongcheol. The bully looked after them. The girl told Sehim to go faster. The offender looked angrily at the heroes. People in raincoats came to a huge building. The elder's voice told everyone to stick together until the end. Someone shouted, drawing attention to the building, and could not believe what they were seeing. The man in the cap looked at the schoolchildren. He said that he knew that it was late and he knew that everyone was tired, but he needed to remain orderly and calm in order to get home quickly. The students expressed their disappointment in unison. The man opened the door to the building and said that while they were waiting for an answer, the children could unpack their things and see their rooms. He ordered them to wait in the hall. Das was amazed by what she saw. The children began to look around in the hall. Someone called this place crap, and the voice of an elder ordered us to take care of each other. The girl smiled and folded her hands to her cheeks. She called Sehim and asked him to take her photo here. The boy looked at her questioningly as she clasped her hands together and tilted her head. He asked if the friend wanted him to take a photo of her. The girl responded positively and said that she did not expect to see this here. People were putting their things on the table. Dasim said she never thought there would be any luxury on such a remote island. Sehim raised his head and looked at the ceiling. He agreed with his friend and said that it was very atmospheric here and looked very elegant. The high hall shone with luxury. The hero added that he would never have thought that he would say such a thing. The girl asked why he was so dissatisfied. On the wall hung a portrait of a man wearing an eye patch. Sehim looked with shame as his girlfriend posed. She told him to take a picture of her so that it would turn out straight. The boy pointed the camera at Dasim and began taking photographs. He asked if he was filming in this case. A tall dark silhouette appeared behind the hero. The silhouette pushed him and the hero dropped the phone from his hands. The phone landed on the floor and the screen became covered with cracks. A tall guy in a black t-shirt turned around and expressed his awkwardness. He looked angrily at the hero and apologized. Sehim looked at the floor and Dongcheol met his comrade. The bully asked what it was and sarcastically said what a pity it was, then laughed. His friend said it was devastating. The hero looked intensely at the floor. Kim Dasim was reflected in the broken screen of the phone. She asked her friend how he was, and then noticed that his phone was badly damaged. The hero sat down with a sigh and rested his cheek on his hand. The girl looked sadly at the boy and said that she was very sorry. The guy's hand reached for the phone. The hero winced and let go of the phone. He made a sound of pain. Dongcheol stood nearby while the hero looked at the hand. He said he cut himself on the glass. The bully called out to his new victim. Sehim turned around, holding the wounded finger in his mouth. The bully fixed an angry gaze on the hero. He asked what he just said. The large figure of Dongcheol approached the heroes. Blood dripped from the boy's finger. He didn't understand what the bully meant. The villain clenched his fists and came close to the child. He asked if he could repeat what he said because he was scared, and then demanded that he repeat what the boy said after Dam. Dasim stood between them. She asked Dongcheol what he was doing, and then added that what Sehim said was none of his business. Dasim looked angrily at the bully. He ordered her to shut up. Dongcheol's irritation was visible on her face. He told the girl that she was confident, after which he added that they had to do something if they did not want him to tie them up, but did not have time to finish the sentence. The children looked at the guy with obvious resentment. The schoolchildren around them began to look at what was happening, and some even ran away. Dongcheol called the hero a worm and asked if he was the first to start. The bully said that if he pushed, then he would be kind enough to apologize. The boy with glasses ran towards the escort, who was talking to someone. The bully asked if he should apologize alone and if he was the only one who pushed the hero. The boy with glasses told everything to the attendant. The man with glasses watched this. Dongcheol bared his fangs and told the hero to answer if he opened his mouth. The bully looked menacingly at Sehim and asked if he was proud of his appearance. The attendant ran up to them and asked if the participants were going to take their seats. Dongcheol glared angrily at the man. He stepped on the hero's phone. The bully put his hand on the boy's shoulder and said that they would see each other later. The man showed his hand and shouted for everyone to follow him. Dongcheol resigned himself. The villain and his friends walked with their hands behind their heads, and the man looked at the heroes. Dongcheol told his friends to go too, and the man told the others to hurry up too. Sehim looked sadly at the phone. The children looked at the saddened hero. Tijon stood among them. The boy chewed his finger and trembled. He continued to chew on his finger until it began to bleed. The two guys looked awkwardly in one direction. They stood near the door behind which something was happening. Sehim's blood was dripping from someone's hand. The voice ordered him to rise. The hero with a bloody face looked into the void. The voice asked if he was deaf. The boy sat on his knees, surrounded by bullies. The bully in the white t-shirt shouted for the guy to get up. Dongcheol raised his hand and told the guy to wait. The main bully approached the hero and asked to show his face. Sehim looked at him. The guy said that the hero's face is not so pretty now. He raised his fist. Dongcheol towered menacingly over Sehim. He said that he was just instilling etiquette in people, and then asked him to show it, and then he would make the boy look like Lee Kijong. 201 rooms. A fist flew into the hero's face. The young man fell to the floor, and the hooligans looked at him menacingly. Dongcheol asked his victim what he said in the hall, and then said that he had a feeling that primitive people had better manners than the hero. He asked the hero for his opinion on why this happened. The villain began to swing his fist for a new blow and said that this is because modern people do not have to chop off 2 heads with an axe. A powerful blow landed on Sehim's stomach. The hero thought that he could not even imagine that he would be the main bully on the same territory. The guy opened his mouth in pain and drool flew from his mouth. The boy remembered that Dongcheol was not on the assignment table and assumed that someone had switched rooms with someone else. The 2 guys stood there with a look of fear on their faces. Pain was visible in the hero's eyes. He thought about breathing and realized that now was not the best time to think about it. Kijong stood aside and watched the beating. The hero thought that if this continued, he would die and mentally asked someone for help. The bully's past victim stood covering his mouth. Sehim realized that Kijong wanted to talk to someone. A smile appeared on the boy's face. The hero lay on the floor and looked at Kijong. The boy did not understand why he was smiling. He realized it was a smirk. The boy stood over the hero and grinned, looking at the beating. Sehim understood that there was no more reason to smile, and it would be nice if someone else was smiling, but not him. The young man did not believe it. Because of the guy's smile, all his teeth were visible. The hero understood that this pain was well known to the smiling one. He couldn't believe that this particular person was mocking him. He looked at Kijong in panic. Panic gave way to anger. Sehim thought that he was the only one who could stand up for this man. He regretted his keen sense of justice. The bullies noticed that the guy was laughing. Kijong started laughing even harder. Dongcheol asked what the boy was doing. He approached the previous victim and asked if it was funny to him that his friend was being beaten. The boy will answer that it is disgusting. The bully looked at Kijong angrily and asked what he had just said, insulting the guy at the same time. Kijong responded with the same insult towards the bully. The smile left the boy's face. He insulted everyone who just sat and watched. The young man's face changed and he was unrecognizable. He said that now the whole air was saturated with rot. Sehim was still sitting on the floor and wiping the blood from his face with his hand. Dongcheol smiled. He placed one hand on Kijong's shoulder and began slapping his cheek with the other. The scoundrel said that the young man was quite funny today and asked if they were covering for each other now. The guy's legs crossed. The bully got close to the boy's face and said that he was right about something. The guy knocked over Kijong with all his might. Dongcheol's face became furious. He asked if the young man's ass itched because they weren't getting along and wondered if that was encouraging. Sehim watched as the bully kicked Kijong violently, wishing him dead. There was indescribable horror on the hero's face. The boy looked away. The hooligans appeared behind the backs of 2 young men, who were very afraid of this. One of the hooligans turned to the boy and said that he would be back soon, so if the elders appeared, the boy should explain everything to them. He asked if he understood what he needed to do. The guy replied that he understood. The bullies started to leave and one of the guys exhaled. The guys looked into the room. The boy in the purple jacket called the hero and apologized. Sehim sat next to the lying Kijong and said that they had nothing to apologize for, as they had their own reasons. The guy in the white t-shirt said that they really had nothing to say, and then asked if the hero was okay, since they heard strange sounds. Sehim looked at the young men. There was a tissue in his nose to stop the bleeding. He said that Dongcheol's attention suddenly shifted from him to Lee Kijong. Kijong tried to get up from the floor. The guy called his name and said that there was nothing surprising in this. The hero added that it was not just Dongcheol's whim. The boy put his hand to his head. The boy in the t-shirt asked what he was talking about and how Kijong had annoyed him. The boy in the jacket said with a metaphor that even the weak and helpless resist. The hero replied that thanks to him he remained alive. Sehim looked sadly at Kijong and said that he has changed and this is the first time he sees him like this. He wondered why the boy took a step when the hero was a centimeter from the offender's fist. The boy leaned his fist on the floor and laughed. He repeated the metaphor of the guy in the sweater, in which he was compared to a worm. The heroes looked at Kijong. One of them called him by name. The young man said that these words turned his head. He rose to his knee and covered his face with his hand, and then said that these words sounded as if he was very easy to crush, and then added that someone was beaten not just because he raised his voice. The young man in the t-shirt raised his hands and turned to his friend. He asked what Kijong was saying and what he meant by it. The boy wiped blood from his face. He asked if the guy really wanted to know and replied that for such a unique person as Dongchul, one sacrifice was enough. Kijeon knelt down and said that he was not the only victim, and even if it was his close friend, the important thing is that everything has already been decided for them. Blood from the boy's nose dripped onto his leg. Kijeon looked up at the guys with a crazy look. He said that he and the hero are intertwined in an endless wheel of violence that turns faster and faster. Bright lightning flashed across his face. The girl screamed in fear. A group of girls were sitting in the room. The girl with glasses said how loud the voice of the one standing in front of them was. She replied that it was scary to the point of goosebumps. The girl with glasses sat with her hand on the back of the sofa, and the one with blonde hair leaned forward to spin the bottle. She replied that the first voice was scarier, and then asked who would be next. The bottle stopped. Dasam was sitting next to the one the bottle pointed to. She said that apparently it was her turn. Dasam asked if she could tell a ghost story. The heroine looked at her with a smile. The girl agreed to tell the story and said that she didn't know much about ghost stories, but she would tell them a story that she had enjoyed reading. The girl sat with her eyes closed. She asked if the others had ever seen talking ants. In the past, their ancestors worshipped gods and made special efforts to communicate with them. The image of the face was carved on stone. Priests, shamans, and many others, no matter what they called those people who had access to a connection with God, acquired great power. Thanks to this privilege, they could become intermediaries of God. There were many different patterns around the stone face. Those who are endowed with such power do very outrageous things in order to gain even more in contact with God. A lot of coins fell out of nowhere. For the gods who were called and came to this world, the desire of a person who was called the Lord Almighty meant practically nothing. Wishes came true. The world is engulfed in the flames of war. The wars continued, and then one tragedy happened, when history was written in notes, not ink. The powerful man's wish came true, but instead of joy he fell into grief. Returning to her question, the girl asked if her friends had seen talking ants. She said to imagine that they were called somewhere by the mervayas. A black ant was crawling on the floor. She suggested that the ant's desires were very, very small. A piece of cake lay on a plate. The girl said that their greatest desire was a handful of sugar, but if they suddenly imagined that the ants in this world had everything, then let them think about what the girls would do. She added that it would not be possible to negotiate or threaten other ants, because they cannot even speak. Functioning in their society in this way would be quite problematic and would end up causing trouble. There was sadness on the girl's face. She said that to solve this problem, all the ants need to be exterminated. A sudden roar interrupted the story. All the girls got scared and jumped up in fear. The blonde folded her arms and became angry, while the dark-haired one began scratching the back of her head. She said that they were scared and asked if there were guys in 304. The blonde asked what was going on there. While the girls were heatedly discussing what was happening, Dasam was sadly silent. The blonde said that Dongchul is in that room. The dark-haired woman replied that it was clear from the sound. She assumed that the bully had insulted someone again and thrown him against the wall. The girl took out her phone in fear. She thought about her friend. She looked at Sehim's contact and wondered if he was okay. One of the girls looked joyfully at the heroine, and she recoiled from her in fear. The girl asked if she had something for Sehim. Dasam asked her again in horror. Dasam looked at everyone nervously. She asked why she had such a frightened look. The girl began to rejoice. The one with glasses said that everything was clear and added that they suited each other very well, and even looked pretty good. The blonde shouted that they were a good girl and a good boy. Dasam headed towards the exit and said that she was tired, and then wished everyone good night. One of the girls squealed and asked if she wanted to hear the guy's voice. The heroine closed the door behind her. She stood leaning against the wall. She thought that she was tired of this banter and thought who even cared about Sehim. The girl started to climb onto the bed and thought why should she worry about what Dongchul would do to the guy. She lay and looked at the ceiling. There were thoughts in her head about what would surely be resolved. She looked away and realized that she was really worried about him. In an unknown cave, a man was kneeling in front of two robed figures. The wounded man looked at the two and asked for mercy. He lowered his head and said he would never do this twice. Unknown figures in red robes looked at him. The man asked to be allowed to prepare the victim again, and then added that the unknown people could hear him. The robed figure raised his hand and the man raised his head when the figure asked him to do so. Hands with purple nails began to do something with their palms facing each other. The man said not to be afraid. Unknown people approached the man and said that his time had come. The man asked to stop and screamed in pain. The hooded woman raised her hand and addressed the newcomer, saying she would do something again, using unknown words. The man was overcome by dark energy and bowed his head. He asked for mercy. The woman said to get this fame. The man rolled his eyes and began to choke. Unknown words continued to come from unknown people. Lightning struck the building. The man said that even if he died, he would gladly serve for the second coming of God. A voice came from a large speaker. The voice announced that the time was exactly 7 o'clock and the morning rise was announced. The class teachers were ordered to count the students and take them to the announcement site. There was a frog sitting on a leaf in front of the house. The leader in the cap yawned, covering his mouth with his hand. Next to the man in the elevator stood a girl with glasses. She turned to Teacher Hajun and assumed that he was tired. She suggested that he rest since they had already distributed the tasks. He replied that Teacher Pagon was going to go with them. The girl looked at the teacher while he spoke. Hajun said that he called the director early in the morning. The girl asked why. The elevator arrived on the second floor. The man said that apparently she was not aware that among their 4th grade students, someone had left the hotel last night, and the principal was very nervous. The teacher was holding a folder in his hands. The girl did not believe what she heard. The young man stood behind the flower and looked at the approaching people. Hajung said it was because Dongchul was a fool. The guy at the flower turned to the others and said that the teacher was coming and ordered everyone to become quiet. The teacher approached the children and told a guy named Yang Junhyuk that he was the loudest. The young man laughed nervously and greeted the teacher. The man reciprocated. Hajun stood in front of the children and addressed a girl named Han Sua. He asked her to give the class leader a list of children who were not in the building right now. She named the names Ma Dongchul, Ho Jiangwu and Xiao Min Hwan. The girl said that 3 people were missing. The man put his hand to his chin and asked if they knew where the rest of the people from class 304 were. They replied that they did not know. The teacher said he understood. He asked who was not feeling well and told those who were not in the best physical shape to raise their hands. Han Sua looked at Dasam, who had a very sad face. Dasam turned to the girl and smiled. Han Sua asked how she was since she didn't look very good. The heroine replied that everything was fine and she just didn't sleep well. Han Sua turned away and the girl's face became sad again. She thought about how she had been having nightmares most of the night. Dasam looked at the floor, lost in her thoughts. Her nightmares were so vivid that she wondered if it was real. She remembered her dream in which she saw a man screaming in pain. The man, struggling in incredible pain, collapsed to the ground as worms tore through his body. The man turned to the heroine. He opened his mouth wide, causing it to be torn. A huge tongue protruded from its mouth, and its body was covered with polyps. The girl had never even heard of such a thing, but after that it was almost impossible to fall asleep. The man and girl turned away from the students. Teacher Hajung said that they were going to leave the hotel for a morning meeting, and in order not to get lost, the children should follow them. The children shouted in unison that they understood, and Dasam thought about room 304. She asked herself if her friend lived there. Suddenly, she saw a guy covering his mouth, yawning, next to her. The guy turned to Dasam. There were bandages on his face. The girl called him by name, and he responded by calling her name. She shyly looked away and said that last night some noise was coming from his room, and today several people disappeared from there. She asked if anything had happened to him and added so that the guy would not take it the wrong way, since she was just asking out of interest. The hero calmly looked at his friend and said that, apart from being beaten a little, nothing happened. But he did not have time to finish, as Dasam interrupted him. Everyone walked along the corridor. Dasam asked what happened to Sekim's face and who did it. The guy asked if she noticed it just now. The heroes, together with everyone else, walked along the red patterned floor. The girl asked if her friend Dongchul beat her up. The hero responded by saying that nothing could be done about it. Sekim walked with his hands on the back of his head. He said it would be nice if the bullies weren't found. He also said that by chance he got into trouble and really hopes that this will not happen again. The guy also said that if the hooligans returned, no one would greet them with applause. People came through the doors in droves. The hero said that even if Dongchul and his friends returned, they would only be scolded. The girl laughed and said that it was true. There was a huge chandelier hanging on the ceiling. The teacher told everyone to gather. The teachers looked at the students. Hajin asked if everything was in place. The man stood and looked around the room. He said that if anyone goes outside, they should take precautions and not go far. People stood outside and went about their business. The guy in the white t-shirt called out to Juwon. 2 friends stood and talked. The guy in the t-shirt asked if anyone had seen that idiot. The guy in the sweater replied that he didn't know and that he hadn't been here all day. The guys turned away and talked among themselves. Juwon said it was like this stupid worm was making fun of them. The friend asked if Sahim got hurt for no reason. The guys looked at the hero and one of them turned to Sekim, who was standing nearby, and asked if this was so. The guy looked away and Dasam looked at him. He said he didn't know. The voice asked everyone for their attention and said that they were now giving the floor to the director. Several people towered over the school children, and the man in white stood and prepared to speak. This man was the director. The director stood with a tired face. He wished everyone good morning and greeted his dear students, and then shouted a slogan about strength, lightness, and enthusiasm. The children watched the director clear his throat. The man stood behind the music stand and said that before the decree was issued, he urgently needed to convey something to the students. Dasim looked questioningly at the director, who said that they would talk about an unpleasant event that happened last night. The teachers also looked at the director. He said they hoped the school trip would be safe for everyone. The director's face was sagging. He said that, to put it mildly, they failed to take all the factors into account. Police cars are parked on the pier. The director said that yesterday the local police on Banhyang Island informed him that a group of looters had broken into the territory of a private house nearby. He was informed that they were placed in a pre-trial detention center. The director looked seriously at everyone gathered and said that the investigation confirmed that the criminals were students from their school, and they signed an agreement to transfer some students. The director continued to look with a serious look. He stated that there were wonderful people working there who had helped them a lot, so he suggested thanking the police for this. Behind the hero stood a guy with a notepad. The principal added that until all students reach home, all schedules related to the school trip are cancelled. The director said that was all he wanted to say. Hojin stood with his eyes closed. Han-Suo became excited when she heard the news. The director stated that they are asking everyone to remain in their rooms until the detainees return, so they will leave a little later. The school children looked at each other nervously. The girls were looking for something with their eyes. The principal expressed hope that teachers and staff will look after the students well. A bead of sweat ran down Dasim's forehead. Next to the director stood a large man in a suit and a woman in a purple dress. The director said that if any problems arise, the hotel staff is always there. The director asked everyone present to wait for the final decision of the police. Kim Dasim looked with a frightened look. She looked at the angry face of the man in the suit. There was something terrible in this man's eyes. The boy was rocking in the sea. The foot stepped on the grass. Dongcheol's exhausted face was dirty. The guy looked at the building, holding onto a tree. The guy was trying to catch his breath. He looked at the hotel and thought that he had survived. There was fear in the bully's eyes. He was glad that the sun had finally risen and he was finally out of this nightmare. 6 hours earlier, night pier, one of the fellow bullies came with packages. He said he brought alcohol. Dongcheol ironically asked who came. The guy was squatting. He looked angrily at the newcomer and demanded a cigarette. He threw him a pack. The main bully opened the package, and his friend rummaged through the package. Dongcheol said that his friend is good. He thanked his brother. While Dongcheol was lighting a cigarette, the third friend told the newcomer that there was not a single open bar here. The chief insulted this place. A guy with short hair was talking to a guy who had just arrived. He said he didn't think it was that bad. The interlocutor told him to stop whining and start drinking. Dongcheol took a drag from his cigarette and turned to a guy named Minwon. He said he feels uncomfortable when he hits little guys, so he should stop whining. Minwon apologized. The guy raised his head, holding a pack of cigarettes in his hands, and apologized again, and then turned to Ho Young. He asked him if he bought them a snack. The guy looked questioningly at the bent Minwon and asked what kind of snacks he was talking about, because he had no money. Minwon said it was weird. The bully took out a cigarette and asked what that smell was. He lit a cigarette and asked if his comrades could smell it. Minwon was holding a cigarette when something jumped out behind him. He noticed that he smelled strongly of fish. Ho Jiangwoo looked in fear at something behind his comrade. Minwon looked at him questioningly. There was an unknown creature behind the bully. The guy asked what they were looking at and assumed that someone was behind him. The bullies trembled. Ho Youngwoo pointed and said there was someone behind Minwon. The guy raised his head and something dripped onto his forehead. He repeated his friend's last word. Standing above the bully was a humanoid creature in a robe and with bandages on his head. The creature was holding a bag in its strange hand. Minwon didn't have time to say anything. He looked at the creature one last time. A huge hand pierced his head. The guys looking at this were scared, and the creature dragged Minwon down. It put a bag over the guy's head while he screamed. Ho Youngwoo raised his fist and asked his friend what kind of crazy guy he was and what he was doing. The bully ran towards the attacker with fists and insults. The unknown person threw the attacker away with a blow. The guy flew behind Dongcheol and he looked at him. The chief got angry. He smashed the bottle on the ground. The guy got into a fighting stance and started screaming at the creature. He ran to the attack, asking who he was running into. The bully swung the bottle at the huge creature. Dongcheol's face showed confusion about what was happening. The monster with glowing eyes looked down. The guy stood under the monster and didn't believe what he saw. Maggots crawled out of the monster's wound. The schoolboy said that the monster was decomposing. True fear settled in the bully's gaze. He realized that he was in a bad situation. He looked at the larvae and realized that the creature was decomposing. The monster began to swing at Dong Kal, and he did not understand what was happening. The monster hit the guy on the head. There was a trail of blood from the pier. All three were sitting with bags on their heads next to the car. The car drove off, illuminating the road. The car sped down the road. Dong Cheol had a bloody bag on her head. All three comrades were sitting tied up in the car. The guy's hands were tied with a rubber tie. Dust flew from under the wheels of the car. The voice said that the kidnapper had done a good job. The car turned along a mountain road. The monster accepted the Red Priestess's praise. A woman in a robe sat in the front seat. She told her partner to control himself as they should act without delay. The kidnapper held the steering wheel with one hand and said that he had no doubt about it, and then started talking about those they had kidnapped. He looked at the guys through the rearview mirror and said that these stray kids deserve the honor of becoming a vessel. Dong Chul sat behind. The driver said they didn't even know how lucky they were. The priestess turned to her friend and said that they were just a messenger of a great being and they must obey his will. The monster replied that he was just grumbling and asked the priestess not to doubt him. On the woman's lap lay a book with an occult symbol and a dagger. She said they didn't have time and asked if her partner saw what was happening. An incomprehensible cluster of light could be seen in the night sky. The priestess said that heavenly equality was approaching. The pink-haired woman turned away and said that they needed to hurry. Finally, she expressed the hope that the Great One would be pleased. The car was driving near the rocks. She turned off the road and headed into the cave. Drops fell from the ceiling. A drop fell on Dong Chul's head. There was a hole in the bag for the guy's eye. He began to regain consciousness. Fear settled in the guy's eyes. He looked at his tied hands. The bully didn't understand what was happening. The guy turned and saw his friend. He asked himself if it was Youngwoo. He called him and tried to wake him up. The match lit the wax candle. The voice told me to close my mouth and ears. A figure in a robe stood at the altar. Three guys were sitting nearby. Dong Chul kept one eye on what was happening. The priestess stood near a large bowl filled with blood. The woman turned to her friend and said that it was time to receive an answer from his strength of faith. The main bully looked at them and shouted. He asked where those sick worms had taken them, and then called them murderers. The guy raised his dirty and crippled hands. He asked whether unknown people wanted to take the lives of school children so easily. Vaughn began talking about the consequences that the kidnappers would have if they did not free them, but did not have time to finish his speech. The priestess stood with her back to the guys. She raised the dagger and said that it was a great honor to be his vessel. She also explained that the ceremony takes time. The woman grabbed the blade with her hand and said that it was simply blasphemy to desecrate such a moment. She held her hand, from which blood was flowing, above the altar. Dong Chul watched this. He saw a knife in the hands of a stranger and thought about this, and also about the fact that one of the kidnappers was a monster. He looked at what was happening in fear and continued to analyze the situation. The guy noticed that the second offender was cutting himself, and came to the conclusion that these crazy people were not the kind of people who would be influenced by threats of going to the authorities. Dong Chul looked away and thought it looked very dangerous. He lowered his gaze. The bully was on his knees, his hands hanging down. The guy didn't know what could happen to him here if he stayed here. He looked into space in fear, realizing that the only way out of here was to escape. The priestess clenched her fist, from which blood flowed. The blood from the arm went straight into the vessel. The monster took the vessel with both hands. He brought it to his face. The kidnapper began to drink the contents of the vessel. Dong Chul saw that the kidnappers were distracted. He realized that this was his chance to escape. The main thing was not to get caught by the villains. The guy didn't know what to do. He decided to see what was behind him. His attention was drawn to the candles burning behind him. Dong Chul realized that if he thought about it, his idea was possible. The guy moved closer to the candle. He began to heat the ties with the fire of a candle and they began to melt. There was pain in the victim's eyes. The fire burned him. His hands were very painful and they were shaking from the heat of the candle. The bully said he just had to endure the pain. A hand with a dagger appeared behind him. Many of the cuts were inflicted on something. The bag on the guy's head began to come apart. The two halves of the bag began to fall off Dong Cheol's head. The priestess stood behind the trio of abductees. She looked at them through the veil that hid her eyes and said that resistance was pointless. Her green eyes were visible through the veil. The woman said that the arrival of divine consciousness has begun, so the guys should relax. Dong Chul turned his head and looked at the priestess. The blood vessel fell to the floor and broke. Everyone looked at the source of the noise. The huge webbed foot of the monster crushed the fragments of the bowl. Drooling dripped from the mouth of the toothy monster. The creature's eyes glowed menacingly. The woman admired the size of the monster. A huge monster with horns was heading towards the victims. The priestess asked if the monster could hear her. Youngwoo moved back in fear and exclaimed that he saw a monster. The monster's mouth was open. The priestess said that she had prepared a sacrifice for the monster, so he must fulfill the will of the Great One and take her sacrifice for using the knowledge of the ancients. The monster ran towards the boys. The beaten Minwon looked at the creature and screamed in fear. The monster punched the guy right through with one hand. The boy was coughing up blood. The monster brought its face closer to him. The bully screamed for help with all his might. The monster's mouth began to open. The priestess told him not to worry and expressed glory to the place where he had found all his lives. The monster started eating Minwon. Youngwoo sat next to the creature's leg and screamed. Another object caught the yellow eye's attention. The woman's voice demanded not to say that anyone was scared, because no matter where they went, it would always be next to them. The monster began to eat the second bully. Dongchul watched in horror at the death of his friends. He didn't understand what it was. The guy turned his head and looked at the priestess. He couldn't believe that what he saw a couple of seconds ago was true. He looked at the floor in panic and realized that a man had been killed in front of him. He definitely didn't expect this. Minwon's bloody body fell to the ground. Dongchul looked at him. The body uttered incomprehensible words. Horror settled in the survivor's eyes. Minwon ran his hands over his head and talked about suffering and pain. He turned to his friend and began to tear himself apart, constantly talking about suffering and pain. The head of the company shouted. He ran away from the priestess with all his might. The woman raised the dagger. She threw the dagger, looking at the fleeing man. The blade was approaching Dongchul. The dagger wounded the guy and he cursed. The priestess attacked the guy who tried to evade. He ran further, but nearby he heard a voice calling his name. Nails scraped the skin off her face. The voice said that it did not want to die. Dongchul, covered in sweat, looked towards the source of the voice. Youngwoo was on his knees and his hand was scratching his face deeply. The guy shouted to his friend and asked him for help. He begged his friend to help. Dongchul ran away from the ceremony site with loud screams. The priestess raised her hand, and smoke came out of the monster's mouth. The monster and the woman stood looking after the fleeing bully. It was a dark night outside. The guy ran through the forest and thought why this happened and how he could get into something like this. He ran with tears in his eyes. The guy continued to run and think that he had to help Youngwoo and Minwon. The bully took his eyes off the road, realizing he needed to call for help. He decided that he would first report to school and then leave. Dongchul stopped and reached into his pocket for his phone. Confused, he pulled out his empty hand. There was no phone in my pocket. The bully was ready to cry. He realized that he had dropped the phone during his escape, or even earlier in that cave. He stood in the middle of the forest, realizing that if he returned there, he might come face to face with these creatures again. Dongchul closed his eyes, tears flowing from them. He wanted this to end quickly. An unknown noise was heard. The guy turned around and realized that it was the sound of the sea. He made his way through the bushes to the source of the noise. The young man jumped out of the thicket. He looked where he was. Dongchul stood on the path above the port and looked into the distance. The guy returned to civilization. He smiled and tears flowed from his eyes. The bully realized that this meant that he was able to return alive. There were workers on the pier and the survivor noticed this. The men were loading something into the truck. Dongchul thought that he would tell them the story and ask for help. He saw the cargo the men were loading. The cargo was jugs with the same symbol as the attackers. The guy looked at this with his mouth open. He approached the fence, not believing that this could happen. Someone's leg appeared behind him. Behind the guy stood a tall bearded man. Dongchul turned around after he started speaking. Horror appeared in the guy's eyes again. The man, holding a pipe in his hands, began to approach more and more. He called the bully a carcass. The stranger extended his hand to the young man and said that he should not be here, since this was a place from which he could escape from the island. Ten's huge hand loomed over Dongchul. The man said he would return the guy to where he belonged. The victim continued to look at the man in horror. Youngwoo is on his knees and holding his face. The guy screams in pain. His fingers are bleeding from his scratched face. The young man shouts to his friend not to run away. Dongchul wakes up screaming in his seat in the car. He looks back. At the back are the vessels. He looks at the cargo in horror when the driver calls him. A bearded man was driving a car and lighting a cigarette. He noticed that the young man had woken up and said that he was sleeping quite soundly. A truck was driving along the road. The man was holding a cigarette and exhaling smoke. He said that he would advise the guy to see a doctor because he is white as a ghost. The driver turned around, holding a cigarette in his mouth, and asked the passenger if he was a student from the mainland. The schoolboy's frightened gaze was reflected in the rear-view mirror. Dongchul swung his fist at the smoking man while he asked if his passenger was on a school trip. The man suggested that the student from Seoul was traveling all the way here to see the miracles. Dongchul's powerful fist flew into the driver's face. The car sped on. The cigarette fell on the asphalt. The car crashed into an obstacle. The wrecked car began to burn. Wounded and wearing a torn t-shirt, Dongchul somehow crawled out of the cabin. The guy was on the roof of the car. His face was as serious as possible. He straightened up and looked into the distance. There was an unknown symbol on his back. A fisherman named Kim Manhwa was interviewed by reporters. He says that here on Banhyang Island, fishermen act in a special way. The children sat in the audience and listened to the story. Kim Manhwa continued to say that fishing using jugs can also be seen in the book Jinoji from Joseon Times. Sehim watched the interview with interest. The fisherman said that it is enough to lower the jar into the sea and the octopus will appear in it on its own, since octopuses have the peculiarity that they hide in the crevices of sea rocks. Hajin yawned as he stood in front of the students. He said that now everyone should go out and practice one after another. He asked those who wanted to see the octopus in the vessel to raise their hand. Dasim walked over to the empty chair next to Jang Sehim. She began to sit down in the empty seat, and the guy looked at her questioningly. The hero asked what the girl was doing here if this was not her place. A friend asked if it was that important. The guy looked at her gloomily while she spoke. Kim Dasim said that she heard him talk to both Juwon and Lee Kaijong before. The hero replied that there was nothing of the kind. The teacher adjusted his cap and asked who wanted to go, and then said that whoever wanted to should come out here. Sehim raised his hand sharply. Kim Dasim suspiciously repeated the hero's last words, and he said that he wanted to go. The girl looked after her friend leaving. Hajin said that the guy can definitely handle it. The hero looked at his palm. There was a jug in front of him. The young man did not understand why he would ask such a thing and got ready to work with the jug. He looked away from his hand, thinking about how Dongchul beat him last night. He didn't understand why there was so much fuss about these worms. The hero stood in front of the table with a jug. Something else was bothering the boy. He took the jug and looked inside. The guy wondered if Kijong had always been like this. It seemed to him that Kijong usually did not say anything and was only silent. The tentacles of an octopus were visible in the dark jug. Sehim looked questioningly at the limbs reaching out to him. The tentacles suddenly jumped out of the jug and reached for the guy. The octopus grabbed the hero's head. The schoolboy was scared, but the octopus did not want to let him go. The tentacles covered him more and more. The boy closed his eyes. The hero looked at the jug in fear and no one held his head. Hajin asked the guy why he froze and told him to let the other guys look too. Sehim didn't understand. The teacher repeated that if the young man had finished, then let him pass the jug to others. The guy looked into the jug, puzzled. He could not formulate a sentence and said that nothing was visible yet. The hero peered inside the vessel, and the teacher looked at him. Hajung asked what the guy was muttering under his breath. The boy replied that he saw. His face froze. The guy said that he clearly sees the creature. It was very dark in the jug. An eye could be seen in the darkness. The hero got scared and dropped the jug, and then collided with Kijong. The vessel broke. Kijong and Sehim were lying on the floor. Sehim pointed to the fragments. The school children looked at the hero. He turned to them and asked if they had seen it. The guy was still sitting on the floor and talking about how he really saw an octopus. Dasim approached her friend. She examined the fragment of the jug. Sehim asked if she saw it. He didn't have time to finish and she said that she knew. The girl looked sadly at the floor. She said that she knows and therefore suggests that we deal with him first. The shadow of his girlfriend hung over the hero's frightened face. He asked what she was talking about. The guy turned around and saw Kijong, who was making some strange sounds. The boys sat very close to each other. Kijong said that he saw him too. The guy looked at the hero with a frightening gaze and described large, horizontally torn pupils. A creepy smile appeared on his face. He added bright yellow sparkling eyes to his description. Beads of sweat ran down Sehim's face. The guys looked at Dasim. Blood was flowing from her finger. The girl tried to stop the bleeding with her mouth. The hero asked if she was okay. She said there was blood. The girl sat sadly on the floor while everyone gathered around her. The friend said she would go get the nurse. The girl took Dasim and told the teacher that her friend was injured and she needed to call a nurse. Hajin asked again in shock. The man lowered his cap and said that we needed to go up to the second floor, as the doctors were there. The girl led Das and replied that she understood. The teacher walked towards the doors and told the others to follow him. Everyone responded in unison with obedience. Sehim began to rise from his knees. Hajin turned to him. The boys looked at their teacher. He said they were staying and could clean up and eat. Kijong turned away and started laughing. The boy stood up with a creepy smile on his face. Saham looked with a serious look. The girls stood and discussed something. Dasam looked at the hero. He remained on one knee, and the girls moved on. Ajung pointed to the door. He said that everyone enters the dining room one at a time, and if anyone sees a mess, they create order. The teacher had a serious face. He said that next, according to the plan, they will again have training videos. The man's speech was interrupted by the fact that he saw something terrible. He opened his eyes wide in surprise. The kidnappers of the trio of hooligans stood in the corridor. Two guys stood with chains around their necks. In front of the people stood a priestess and a tall monster who was holding the guys on a chain. The woman smiled. Hajin stood in the doorway, and in front of him were children on a chain. There was confusion on the man's face. He recognized the hostages as his students. The teacher looked at them worriedly and asked what was happening to them. Massive bows hung on the guys' necks. The robed creatures looked at Hajin. He asked if they had shackled them. The man walked towards them and noticed their necks and asked if they had stabbed them. The director looked out from behind the doors. He walked up to Hajin. The teacher indignantly asked the principal if he had seen this. The director told the man not to rush. The director ran his finger over his face. Hajin asked what it means to not rush and said about the exhausted faces of the guys. The director replied that the teacher should be careful in what he says, since there are children standing behind him and everyone is listening. He then added that these people helped bring back the missing students. Two men in robes towered angrily above everyone. Hajin looked at this in surprise. The man turned and silently looked at the children. Kim Dasam and Kodoli watched what was happening until the teacher called them. He stood with his head turned towards them and said that they needed to go to the first aid station. The man showed the girls where to go and told them to quickly come back and go eat. Doli agreed and told her friend to go. Dasam looked at the newcomers. They stood with their backs to her. For her, they were somehow different, and it wasn't even about the clothes, but about the atmosphere. She turned away and went to the infirmary. The girl assumed that the guests were not from these parts. She couldn't shake the feeling that she had seen them somewhere before. Something was wrong. Dasam's pupil became green and bifurcated. She turned to her friend, who said she was bleeding. The girl said that it was so, because she got hurt. Doli looked at her worriedly and said that there shouldn't be so much blood from her wound on her hand. Blood was gushing from a wound on his finger. The heroine has not yet noticed this. She asked what her friend was talking about. She squeezed the hand that was bleeding. There was fear in her gaze. She didn't understand what was happening. The girl's eyes began to close. The friend ran to Dasam, who began to fall unconscious. Someone caught her body. The suited figure held the girl, and Doli ran up to them and thanked them for saving her. The savior was that same formidable man with glasses. He motioned for the girl to shut up. She looked at the man silently. Hajun looked out the back door, looking for the girls. He said he immediately told them to go to the aid station. Opposite Hajin stood the director. The man asked if the teacher remembered what he told him. The director recalled that despite the fact that their methods are quite rude, they are wonderful people. Hajin didn't really understand what was said. The teacher bowed to those who came and said that they thanked them for bringing their students to them safe. The man reached into his shirt pocket and said that he almost made a mistake without realizing it. He handed his business card to the priestess and said that he would really appreciate it if they contacted them at this number next time. Minhwan and Jiangwu stood with chains around their necks as before. The teacher asked to remove these things from them, since they need to send these guys to their place. The woman smiled slyly and said that they had already taken their seats. Shi Huijun looked at her angrily and asked loudly what she said. The director gestured during the conversation, and the teacher held his hand. The man in the white shirt told Hajin to speak calmly and listen. He then explained that he would take care of these children, so let the teacher stick to his schedule. The attendant turned away from the director with an expression of dissatisfaction. As a result, the man looked at the director again and said that he would do so. There was seafood on the plate. The dining room baskets contained a variety of sea creatures. Everyone was sitting at tables. Waiters served people. Sehim put a plate of crab on the table. The guy sat down at the table, leaned on his hand and sighed. The guy sitting next to him asked if the hero sighed over the local delicacy. The boys looked at the hero with a smile. One of them remembered that the young man said that he was allergic to food, and then said that Sekhim no longer knows where to put his nose. The guy sarcastically told the hero not to worry, as his brother would take care of the crab. The boy turned away from the plate and said to those who took the crab, if that's all. He turned his gaze to the guys and asked if they had seen Kaijong. The chewing voice replied that he had not appeared. Han Suo walked up to the guys with a plate of octopus and said that Kaijong skipped dinner and went to his room. The girl stood nearby while the guys sat on chairs. She said that according to Kijon, he buys food at a nearby supermarket or something like that. The guy asked why. Sua looked away thoughtfully. She assumed that he had some kind of illness that prevented him from eating seafood. Sekim remained silent in response. The guy was looking at something without taking his eyes off. His face was reflected in the spoon. He peered more and more into the reflection. Red flash of a product scanner at the checkout. Sekim stood opposite the cashier. The cashier said it was 7,601 per hero. She asked if he needed the package. The hero sadly looked into nowhere and said that he was needed. The guy was walking down the corridor with a bag of groceries. The package contained iron cans. Sekim walked, looking at the floor. He wondered why everyone was so calm, even after bringing back the perpetrators of school violence. He walked up the steps. The hero went out into another corridor. There were thoughts in his head that he was trying his best to ignore it. He remembered Lee Kaijong's words that he had nothing to do with this. He couldn't believe that everyone was happy with the chain of suffering the boy was talking about. Sekim stopped. He wondered if he was the only one who was upset by such a story of despair. The guy understood that these were just people who would not do anything unless there was a reason to do so. Room 201. Sehim stood in front of the door to the room. He decided that he would show Kaijong that he was not like that. The hero reached for the door handle. The door opened from the inside, which the guy was clearly surprised by. Kijon stood in the doorway with a briefcase. Sehim looked at him. They stood opposite each other. Dasam's hand was bandaged. The nurse wiped her forehead with her hand. She said she was done and everything would be okay now. The girl said that the wound was shallow, but the heroine had just experienced another heavy bleeding, so there was no need to remove the bandage yet. She suggested waiting until everything healed. Dolly stood next to Das while the nurse explained everything. The girls looked joyfully at the nurse and thanked Nurse Pogon. The nurse sat with her legs crossed. Her phone vibrated. She expressed hope that there would be no more cuts. The girl took the phone and went out for a while. She said that she would come out for a minute, and then recommended that the guys sit here for another 15 minutes, after which they could go eat. Dolly remained silent. The girl turned to her friend and smiled. She asked Dasam how her hand was and if it was better. The girl replied that thanks to her friend, everything was fine. Dolly turned away and said it was good. Dasam called her friend a Wonder Woman. She raised her hand and asked how Dolly was able to drag her here after she lost consciousness. The savior headed towards the exit and extended her hand to the heroine. She said that there was nothing special about it, and then asked if her friend needed anything at the store. Dasam asked for Coke Zero, but something suddenly came to her mind. The smile left her face. She said she wanted to ask something before the girl left. Dasam sat modestly on a chair. The schoolgirl said that there were people who came into the hall recently. Dolly realized that her friend was talking about those wanderers in unusual costumes. The heroine continued to look at her friend. She said that she was talking about them and asked if Dolly felt anything strange. The girl folded her hands and assumed that they were talking about chains. She had never seen anything like this before. Dasam said that's not really what he's talking about. She clutched her injured hand and lowered her head. The heroine looked at her hand. She was overcome by a feeling that made her skin shiver. Dolly went out and waved her hand, saying that she did not know anything, since she was very hungry and her head was not thinking at all. The friend said that they would discuss this later and she would be back soon. Dasam asked Dolly to unsubscribe when she comes. The girl stared at the floor. She closed her eyes as if she was in pain. The heroine was lying on the bed with the phone. She was sure that she had seen unusual guests somewhere. Dasam turned to the wall and discovered that there was no signal. She put an earphone in her ear. The girl lay and listened to music. Behind the girl there was a window into which an unknown person was looking. A frightened eye peered into the room through the window. The silhouette stood leaning on the glass. There was a bloody handprint on the window. A leaf flew into the slightly open window. The leaf flew over Das's bed. The girl sat up on the bed, and the leaf was still flying around the room. She looked at the open window. The girl took out her earphone. There was blood on the intruder's cheek. He was breathing heavily. The heroine was scared. A dirty and frightened Ma Dongchul looked at her. Dasam tried to call for help on the phone, but the bully snatched the phone from her hand. She closed her eyes and screamed. The guy looked at her, gritting his teeth. He turned to her. The girl fell to the floor, and Dongchul was holding her phone in his hands. The frightened girl looked at what was happening with one eye. The bully was cursing and trying to find something on his phone. This island was enough for him. The guy looked at the phone screen. He asked what it was. He looked closely at the interface and loudly asked again what it was. There was no signal on the phone. Dongchial's eyes grew even more furious. He began destroying the room while Dasam turned away from the psychopath. The girl looked at the guy in fear. The bully walked towards the exit. The unknown symbol was still visible on his back. An image of the same symbol, but red, appeared in the girl's head. Her head began to spin. She saw the image of a priestess. Dasim began to lose consciousness again. Room 201. Kijon and Sehim stood opposite each other. The hero said about lunch. The young man smiled and asked if his friend had dinner yet. The boy started rummaging through the bag and asking if Kijong said he was allergic to seafood. He took out a corn product and handed it to the guy. Sehim offered to eat it together since it was too much for him alone. Kijong looked at the food his guest was handing him. A strange smile appeared on the boy's face. He said that they were similar after all. The strange young man handed the guest his briefcase. The hero looked at him excitedly and asked what it was. Kijong's head was tilted down, but his gaze was directed at his interlocutor. He said that the guy came all the way here, and now he says that he doesn't know anything. And then he said to take something out of the briefcase. Sehim looked at the backpack with confusion. The guy was shocked by what he saw. The hero took out the priestess's blade from his backpack. The boy clutched the briefcase to himself and asked Kijong why he brought it. He replied that the hero himself knows everything. He looked at the hero with an empty gaze and said that the eyes are a revelation. Sehim recoiled from his comrade and said that he did not understand what kind of revelation he was talking about. Kijong grabbed his head and said that he could not see anything with these eyes and only those who had received the choice could look. He held his hand on his head and looked at the guy. He said they are living up to expectations. The young man's gaze became even more creepy. One of his eyes was narrowed. Kijong told the hero to cut out the bridle and show it to those who stigmatize them. He approached Sehim and demanded to take the knife. The boy continued to look at the hero with creepy eyes. He said that he would have the honor of tasting the bridal meat, just a piece. There was a strange smile on the guy's face. The crazy guy talked about if it was possible to save everyone, and then asked if the hero could joyfully hold a knife. Sehim walked away from the boy and asked why he should do this. Kijong confirmed that he should be the one to do this, because the guy is good at enduring the pain of other people. Fear settled in Sehim's eyes. One word came out of the guy's mouth. He spoke thoughtfully about the sacrifice. Kijong stood and looked at the hero, who asked about the words Ma Dongchul said earlier. The boy scratched the back of his head and asked again, since he did not hear what the interlocutor said. He smiled and asked if Sehim was targeting Dongchul. The guy looked at Kijong in complete bewilderment, and he said that the trio of hooligans did not count. The strange boy got angry and raised his hands. He said that thanks to the hero, his plan is a little creaky, but the most important thing will be to cut the bridle. He demanded the hero to do this. Something caught Kijong's attention when he was talking about what Sehim should do. He looked at the boy's shaking legs. Dasim's blonde friend screamed. Dongchul lowered his eyes. He ran along the corridor and tried to catch a phone signal, swearing and cursing the island along the way. The bully looked at the phone interface in hopes of getting a signal. Schoolchildren filmed the bully on their phones. He shouted at them to stop doing this and then added that they were just as bad as he was. Something caught his attention. Dongchul headed towards the stairs. His body reacted faster than he could think. The guy rushed up the stairs with thoughts about the roof. While he ran up, the bully looked at the phone. He suggested that the highest place on this island is conducive to radio waves. Dongchul ran upward with all his might. He was sure that he would get a connection there. He immediately needed to send a rescue signal outside. The director appeared from around the turn of the stairs. The priestess followed the director. The woman looked at Dongchul. Dasim's phone broke on the floor. The bully also fell to the floor and looked at those who were in front of him. He looked at the director and his captors. He couldn't believe they were here. There was intense fear on his face. He started to panic. The director raised his hand and began to scold the guy. The man asked how Dongchul could act like that in front of his elders. The priestess picked up the phone, and the bully shouted not to do this to him. The woman held the broken phone with both hands. She told Dongchul that they met again. The kidnapper looked at the phone and smiled. She said she was the first to find her place. Dongchul continued to speak harshly out of fear. The priestess raised her head and told the guy that he better think twice before trying to leave this island. Kijong and Sehim turned around when they heard screams. The guy grabbed the briefcase from the hero's hand. The hero asked what he was doing. Kijong looked mysteriously at his comrade and said that he was not ready for anything. The young man went somewhere. Sehim said that he had just heard screams and asked where he had gone. Kijong said to follow him. The hero looked after the departing man, who said that they would do this together since the hero has the right to do so. The boy was in shock, looking at his classmate. The nurse wrote to Hajun that she was on duty tomorrow and needed to confirm her list of supervisory responsibilities. Hajun replied that if she was talking about the class teachers, then he had already confirmed everything. On July 3rd, the girl wrote that the director called her and she would have to leave urgently. The nurse walked down the corridor and looked at the phone screen. She didn't understand where the signal went. She met with physical teacher Hajun. The girl was surprised at the meeting. The man, not understanding what the nurse was talking about, looked at her. She asked if he had already gone to meet the director. The teacher asked what she was talking about. The girl tilted her head and said that she sent the message in the morning. Sweat appeared on the physical teacher's face. He asked what message she was talking about. He denied it. The man stood in front of her with his hands down. Hajun said that the principal went to the infirmary with the missing students. The nurse asked if the missing people had returned. Excitement appeared in the teacher's eyes. Dongchul knocked the phone out of the priestess' hands. He stood up and asked if the woman was telling him to change his mind about leaving the island. The bully clenched his teeth in anger and said if he should do this because of the nonsense she was spouting, and then asked if she thought they would listen to murderers like them. The woman looked calmly at the guy. Dongchul leaned over, swearing loudly. The director raised his finger and tried to stop the guy, but he ordered him to shut up and asked if he knew what these psychos were doing. The director looked at him angrily and asked what he was talking about. Dongchul continued to scream. He said that they were lying and was going to tell what they wanted to do to him and his friends. The guy was interrupted by Hajun, who was standing nearby. The teacher called him by name. The bully looked in fear in the direction of the voice and realized that this was a cool manual. The physical education teacher shouted to him, simultaneously spreading his arms, that everything was fine with Minwon and Jiangwu. The teacher looked at Dongchul and said that everything he sees is true. Hajun opened his mouth wide so that the guy could hear him. He shouted for the young man to stop whatever he was doing and get down. The bully glared at the people and refused to get down. The guy's fangs were sharp, like those of an animal. He told Hajun not to tell lies. The man did not understand what this meant and looked at the student with a lost look. Dongchul stood alone in front of the crowd and shouted that he saw with his own eyes how his friends died, because he was there. The guy didn't understand why no one believed him. People turned away. Hajun covered his mouth with his hand. The bully raised his hand and asked if these people thought he was unhealthy. Fury appeared on the guy's face again. He stated that he could be handed over to the police if they did not believe him, and there would be nothing to worry about. A man in a black suit appeared among the crowd. He said there was no need for what the guy said. The man looked at Dongchul angrily and said that he would make him make sure, and then ordered him to look carefully. Behind the chained man were Minwon and Jiangwu. He said the missing students were safe and sound. Dongchul was clearly surprised by what he saw. The man looked at his partner, holding the key in his hands. The key was inserted into the corresponding hole. The lock on Minwon's neck opened. The shackles fell to the floor. The bully looked at this and did not understand how this was possible. There were marine polyps on the guy's necks. Tears appeared in the bully's eyes. He looked at Minwon's neck. Dongchul screamed as tears flowed from his eyes. The attendants looked at him. The bald man smiled while Dongchul insulted him. Blood sprayed from the guy's forehead. Blood sprayed in all directions. The bully left the place and asked what they had done to his friends. The priestess and her charge looked after the guy. Dongchul looked at the kidnappers. He said he would never forgive them. Taijung's feet ran along the corridor. The bully raised his hand to hit his enemies and threatened everyone with death. Kijun appeared behind the villains. He was holding a briefcase in his hands. Dongchul was about to hit the priestess. Kijun jumped between the director and the priestess's companion. The bully's fist was a few centimeters from the woman's face. He looked at her angrily. The formidable young man was very close to punishing the kidnappers. Something surprised him. Kijun held his briefcase. The boy flew straight towards Dongchul. He had a crazy grin on his face. The grin turned into a wide smile. The young man flew straight into the bully. The priestess's savior sat on the floor and touched his chin with his hand. Dongchul was lying on the floor and Kaijung started laughing. He turned his gaze and said that he had finally reached the end. With a crazy smile, the boy reached into his briefcase with his hand. The smile left his face as he looked at his briefcase. He didn't have time to say what awaited him now. Kijun looked into his briefcase and could not find his dagger. He was sure that the dagger was here and did not understand why it was not there. The boy turned around. Sehim stood behind the men, holding his hand behind his back. The guy looked at him sadly. Malice appeared in Kijun's eyes and he turned to the thief. Sehim stood and hid the dagger behind his back while Kaijong and the priestess sat near Dongchul, who was unconscious. The boy asked the hero what he had done. The hero stood and did not understand what was happening. He held the dagger behind his back and looked at what was happening. He didn't understand how it had come to this. The physical education teacher and the nurse tried to calm everyone down. There was fear on the guy's face. The priestess was sitting on the steps, and the man with the first aid kit was trying to revive Dongchul. Others were taking Kijun somewhere. Sekhim did not understand what was happening here. He opened his eyes wide and looked forward. Minhwan and Jiangwu stood with marks on their necks, and the hero wondered why everyone was inactive. Kijong cried as he was taken away. Sehim just wanted to do something good. The roaring guy peeked out from behind the stranger's robes. The headmaster clasped his hands together as he stood next to the priestess and her partner. The hero turned his gaze to them. The director apologized to the priestess and asked if she was okay, after which he assumed that she was uncomfortable. The woman replied that she was fine and there were more important things to do. They left and the priestess said that the schedule should not be violated. The director agreed with her. The hero saw a strange shadow on the wall from those leaving, while the director told them that they definitely would not be disappointed. The shadow on the wall looked like tentacles. The man said that he would show everything to the guests himself, and then added that he meant tonight. First aid station. Das was called by name. The girl heard, but did not open her eyes. Sehim and Sua stood over her bed. She, the heroine, opened her eyes and Sua was happy. Dasim stood up abruptly and threateningly asked where Dongkal was. The girl was handed a broken phone and told to calm down. She picked up her phone and started looking at the broken screen. Sua said that this guy fainted after his extravagance, and the teachers took him to the hospital. Excitement was visible in Dasim's eyes. She sat with her legs modestly crossed. The girl thanked those present. The friend turned to the hero with a smile and said that he should be thanked. The guy didn't understand what she was talking about. The hero looked away irritably, and a sly grin appeared on the girl's face. She asked who discovered the phone in all the chaos. He asked what he could say here. The heroine looked at the boy while Sua asked him how he realized that it was Dasim's phone. He didn't have time to answer. The girl closed her eyes and laughed. The guy looked at her questioningly. She thanked Sehim for worrying about her. The hero blushed. They looked at each other. Sua was about to say something. She looked at Sehim carefully and asked if he knew that he was blushing and noticed that it was strange. The guy put his hand to his face, and Sua began to smile and play with her fingers. She asked what it was and asked him to say something. The girl poked Sehim with her elbow and, jokingly calling him a worm, asked if he had fallen in love. The priestess's dagger fell to the floor. All three looked at him. Fear appeared on the faces of the heroes. Sehim stepped on it, wanting to hide it from the girl's eyes. He waved his hands excitedly and tried to figure out what it was. The girls realized that it was a knife. Sua got scared while Dasim looked at the floor. A friend asked why the hero needed a knife. Dasim approached Sehim. She stood silently and looked at him. The girl's face came closer to the hero's face. She lowered herself to look at what the guy was hiding. The heroine sat down on one knee. She looked at the dagger and Sehim asked what she was doing. The symbol from Danchial's back appeared in her head. The same symbol was on the hilt of the dagger. Dasim picked up the priestess's thing, and Sua looked at her in surprise and asked if it was a real blade. Dasim turned to her friend. He looked at her in fear and responded. She stood with her back to him, her head turned. She looked at him seriously and asked him to tell him that he knew everything. Hospital building in the city. It was written on the building that it was a Banhyang hospital. Through the window, Hajin could be seen standing in front of the police. The finger pressed the button. The man walked with his hands in his pockets. He looked thoughtfully at his feet. He held a can of cola in his hands. The physical education teacher came to where Dongkal and the nurse were waiting for him. He walked up to her, scratched his head, handed her a drink and asked her to excuse him. She replied that you're welcome. The girl took the can in her hands and asked what the police said. Dongchul sat on the side. Hajin said there have been no reports of overturned cars until today. There was irritation on the guy's face. He turned sharply to the teacher and raised his finger. The bully began to say that this could not happen and that it was obvious that the priestess had arranged everything. Hajin held another can of cola in his hand. He turned to the student and said that he had not yet spoken. The guy's eye was bandaged and he was looking at the drink. The physical education teacher said that everything that happened seems very strange to him and he considers the guy's words to be nonsense, a consequence of something. The man raised his hand and asked if the teacher does not try to understand the student, then who will do it? The nurse looked at the man quietly. Dongchial became worried. A bead of sweat ran down his face. The teacher repeated that he did not believe his words, but would try to believe him. He turned his back to them. The teacher squeezed the can and it burst. Hajin said that those who dare to chain his students like dogs and pretend that this is the norm, he will never be able to believe. His face was not visible from the outside. The teacher raised his head and anger was visible on his face. The hotel workers dragged Kaijong up the stairs. They opened the door and were discussing something. The guy was held by the scruff of the neck. There was fear on his face. He was thrown into the room. The boy winced in pain. The woman closed the door. She looked at Kijong even when there was a small gap between the door and the wall. The guy was lying on the floor. Saliva dripped from his mouth. An unknown voice asked him to come over. The boy looked into the darkness. He asked who was there. The voice came from the mirror. The voice called him to it. Kijon looked at the mirror with fear. The voice ordered not to be afraid of him. The same eye that Kijon and Sehim saw was visible in the mirror. The eye called to its child to come closer. A symbol from Dongchial's back was drawn on the paper. The guy with glasses looked and didn't understand what it was. He assumed it was some kind of psychological test. The girl with brown hair looked and asked if it was a new brand. The dark-haired guy looked and couldn't tell what was in front of him. He scratched his head, apologized to Das and said that he did not understand anything, and then apologized. The girl thanked him. Sehim and Dasim stood together. Sua approached them and asked if it was necessary to go that far. The girl looked at her and was interested that even if someone knows what this sign means, it won't stop her friend. The children discussed their actions. Their acquaintances were walking along the corridor. Sehim asked if it would be better for them to leave this undertaking in the hands of the teachers. Friend Sehim and girlfriend Dasim approached them. The guy said that they were going to a cafe. The girl was glad that she had finally found Dasim and the headman. The heroes looked at their friends. Sehim's friend asked if he wanted to go with them. Dasim was holding a paper with a symbol in her hands. Her friend asked what she had in her hands. The girl looked at the drawing and said that it didn't matter. The girl with glasses pointed her finger at Dasim and said that it looked like Arabic writing. Friend Sehim told her that Gayun was minding her own business again and asked if there was room for her to be smarter. The girl stood with her hand on her side when Dasim called her. The heroine approached her, clutching a piece of paper. She asked to tell me more about the letters. The girl told her to be quiet and not yell. The light fell on the cafe. Dasim stood in front of the people who were sitting at the table. The blonde drank iced coffee from a straw and concluded that the coffee that others buy tastes better. Dasim looked at Yoon and showed the symbol, asking her to finally tell her about it. The girl also sat down at the table, holding a paper in her hand. She asked if she said it was an Arabic hieroglyph. The girl with a cup in her hands looked at him and replied that she had said so. She peered at the drawing. Yoon said that this is the so-called Arabic hieroglyph and she once saw an authoritative expert talk about it. The guy squeezed into the conversation. The blonde stood nearby and drank coffee, and Yoon was irritated by this. The young man wondered if she had seen it on YouTube. The blonde asked if the girl was talking about world conspiracies again. Yoon turned to her friend and rudely ordered not to compare this with any occult conspiracies, because we are talking about this symbol. She explained that it was practically used in the ancient Arab state. The blonde and Sua looked at each other. The first asked how this differs from the occult and conspiracies. Sua said to forget about it. The girl with glasses continued to rudely explain the meaning of the symbol. She said that such symbols were especially used in rituals and ceremonies. Sehim stopped her. The guy looked interested and asked her about the ceremony. Dasim got into the conversation and asked if her friend knew in which ceremonies this symbol was used. The girl replied that she was interested, so she knew. She leaned back in her chair and raised her hand, saying that it was connected with sacrifices. Yoon looked to the side. The light reflected off her glasses. She said that this was a rather unusual case of witchcraft. Yoon continued talking. Beads of sweat ran down her face. She said that this ritual involves calling a powerful being to descend into this world and asked whether it should be called a calling ceremony. Everyone around sat and stood in silence. Friend Sehim asked what this meant. The blonde looked at the narrator with a smile. Juwon said that the girl lives up to all expectations and, as always, tells horror stories. Yoon responded by calling him a fool. The guy sat with his eyes closed, and Yoon clenched her fists in anger. She said that she was talking about the symbol being used in practice. Juwon ironically replied that he believed. The heroes looked at each other. Sehim stood up menacingly from the table. Yoon looked at him. The boy held the priestess's dagger in his hands. They asked him what it was. He put it on the table. The guys looked at the dagger. The girl with glasses looked at the hero and he said that if everything is as she says, they are in a bad position. His face didn't look like he was joking. His friends looked at him in fear. Sehim's friend smiled nervously and asked if it was a joke. He replied that he was sincere. The blonde and the dark-haired one looked at him curiously. The boy asked him to tell him in more detail. The girl joined the request. The hero said to listen carefully. He picked up the blade and said it was from Kijong's backpack. The friend looked scared and repeated his classmate's name. The blade lay on the table next to the dishes. Sehim replied that this is indeed the Kijong blade and he does not know where this dagger came from. He looked up at the people and said that if he had not taken it, there might have been a murder today. Everyone looked at the hero. Sehim's friend laughed and raised his hand. He said that this was an assumption and that this could not happen. He couldn't believe that their Kijong could do something like that. Someone's foot appeared in the doorway. The boy told Sehim that he was thinking too much. Ju-won put his hands up and agreed with Yu-jun, no matter how crazy Kaijong was. The girls looked at something behind the guy as he said that their classmate was not brave enough to cross the line. Everyone wasn't looking at Ju-won, but at something behind him. He continued to talk about how everyone was confused because they had experienced a shocking event. Noticing that his friends were not looking at him, he asked where they were looking and whether they could hear him at all. A shadow fell on Ju-won's face and he realized that there was something or someone behind him. Sunwoo and Minwon stood behind him menacingly. Youngwoo grabbed Ju-won's shoulder with his teeth. The guy screamed. Minwon bites the guy's finger. The boy looked at the bloody finger with tears in his eyes. Ju-won fell out of his chair. Sehim and Jun looked at what was happening, not understanding what was happening. The boy screamed and asked what was wrong with his hand, and also screamed about his finger being wounded. The bully stood over the crawling Ju-won. He crawled to the heroes and asked for help. The brutalized guys stood and did nothing. Sehim looked at them. Minwon looked at the hero, gritting his teeth. The hooligans rushed towards the heroes. Jun extended his hand while Sehim stood with the dagger in his hands. The guy said he couldn't move. The hero's friend threw the cup, ordering everyone to disperse. The cup broke into pieces on Minwon's face. He fell, and Youngwoo continued to approach the heroes. The blonde kicked the guy. The girl stood on one leg while Yoon and Dasim looked at her in surprise. The heroes looked at the devastation and the traumatized Ju-won. The boy's finger lay in a pool of blood. The guys looked at it in horror. Sweat appeared on Dasim's face. The girls looked at what had happened in fear. Ju-won lay on the floor and regretted losing his finger. Sua sat down next to the wounded man and told him to breathe more easily. The girl turned to Yoon and asked what was happening here. She looked at the destruction with her hand over her mouth. She replied that, as she suspected, these guys were already dead. The bullies' bodies lay on the floor. Dasim excitedly turned to her friend. She asked how this was possible and the girl replied that it was about the hieroglyph that the heroine showed. Yoon removed her hand from her face and assumed that someone had used it on them. The blonde turned to the know-it-all, and she looked at her seriously. The girl's eyebrows furrowed and she asked Yoon if she was aware of the situation, and added that now was not the time for jokes. Yoon looked angrily at her friend and asked if she was speaking like that, realizing the situation they were in. Dasim lowered her gaze, and the blonde continued to defend her position. She asked what difference it made. Yoon stood in an important pose, and her opponent clenched her fists. The girl asked what was important to the blonde, besides social networks. Finally, she told her to shut up, calling her by her name, Songmin. Sua looked at the hooligans who began to rise. Min continued to argue, saying that she said everything, unlike Yoon. Sua looked excitedly at the shadows hanging over her and called the guys. The guys stood next to the girl while the others tried to break up the conflict. Yoon asked if she needed to explain how stupid those who disagree with her were, and Min began to threaten. Sua jumped back and screamed. Dasim and Sehim noticed something was wrong. Youngwoo twisted his neck unnaturally. The guy's head returned to its previous position and he looked at the heroes. He extended his hand towards the frightened Sua. She looked at the hand, clenching her fists. Dasim shouted and called the headman. She clenched her fists and ordered the girl to get ready. The heroine took a chair and said that she would help now. Sehim addressed the girl by name. She picked up the chair. There was a look of rage on her face. The girl ran towards the enemies, putting a chair in front of her. Sua watched in horror as her friend took down the bully. Dasim looked at the headman and ordered her to run. She turned around as she crawled towards the exit and tried to thank her friend for saving her. The heroine fought with the enemies, and Sua ran to the exit and thanked the savior. The hand grabbed the heroine by the shoulder. She was horrified when she looked at the person who grabbed her. Minwon has new polyps on her face. The guy stood in front of the girl with an aggressive expression on his face. Sua ran as fast as she could down the street. She ran into the hotel. The girl fell at the entrance. Dolly saw the headman on the floor. She got scared and called her. The girl came and sat down next to Sua, and then asked if everything was okay. The friend could not answer. The elder wiped away her tears with her hands. She said about the finger and the blood, and then added that Ju-won could have died. Dolly calmed the girl down and said that they would sort it out now. Sua covered her eyes with her hand. She said that we need to bring teachers to the cafe to help. Dolly looked at Sua. The girl ran to look for help and told the headman that she understood her, and she thanked Dolly. The small cafe building was located among the trees. Dark silhouettes could be seen in the window. Sehim pushed Minwon out the window, breaking it into pieces. The guy held the bully with both hands. There was fear on his face. They landed on the street. Everyone looked at the landing site and called out to the hero. The guy stood up and looked at his friends. Min asked if he was okay. Sehim shouted to the guys to run, and Jun said that he didn't hear what he said. The hero looked angrily and loudly ordered everyone to quickly run away from here. The girls looked at Young standing behind them. Yoon asked if they should run. Everyone looked at the monster and screamed. There were no shoes on one of his feet and various living creatures were crawling on his legs. Sechem looked towards the enemy. A monster with a broken chest walked towards the heroes and growled. He opened his mouth, from which blood gushed, and screamed. The beaten monster that used to be Young screamed and growled. All the heroes stood nearby and prepared to confront him. Min asked why he didn't lose consciousness from her blow. Yoon said it was necromancy. June turned to the girl in fear and asked what she was talking about. She replied that she had already said so. They remembered the symbol that Dasam showed and Yoon said that these guys are already corpses. She put her hand to her face as Jun and Min looked at her in horror. The girl asked how something that is already dead can die. The boy asked what they should do then. Min called June. She pointed downward when he turned to her. The guy asked what she wanted from him. The blonde told him to look at his feet. Ju-won looked down at his feet. Worms and centipedes were crawling along the guy's legs. He shouted what an abomination this was. The guy screamed very loudly. He screamed that he couldn't move. Insects engulfed his leg. Everyone looked at their feet and were horrified by what they saw. Blood appeared on Dasam's bandage and she grabbed her hand in pain. Sehim asked what happened. The girl leaned forward and didn't respond. The hero was horrified. Tentacles appeared from under the bandages. The guy realized that something had been done to her too. The guys looked at Dasam. Ju-won shouted to her to be careful as it was coming towards her. The girl was holding her hand. Sekhim thought that this was dangerous and should not be allowed to happen. Tears appeared in Dasam's eyes. The hero assumed that she also had contact with these monsters. The guy's eyes expressed fear for his girlfriend's life. The monster opened its bloody mouth. Sehim shouted at him to stop. The monster did not stop and opened its mouth wider. The hero shouted in rage to stop attacking, causing these hieroglyph effects. The monsters stopped. Yoon turned around. The girl looked at her feet and saw that the insects began to retreat. Sekhim looked straight ahead angrily. More and more tentacles burst out from Dasam's hand. The hero closed his eyes. The monsters approached the guy and prepared to attack. Min and Jun pushed the creatures away from Sehim with powerful blows. The monsters fell into the water. They began to sink to the bottom while the heroes watched. Ju-won's finger was floating in the water. The bearded man blew his whistle. He called the schoolchildren. They looked at him. The man, accompanied by his partners, ordered everyone to disperse. Sekhim began to wave his hand. He angrily asked if a man in such a situation would simply order him to leave. The man stopped the hero. He looked forward and said that first of all it was necessary to help the wounded. He continued to look and say that now everyone is returning to their rooms. Sehim looked at Dasam, who took out her phone. The heroine's hand was grabbed. The woman working here was holding the girl's hand. She looked at Dasam with a scary smile. Dasam was scared. The girl pulled her hand out of the grip. The finger continued to lie in the water. There were clouds in the sky. Sekhim sadly held the phone and listened to the beeps followed by a message that the subscriber was unavailable. The heroes were walking down the street and the guy said that the one he called was still not answering. The guy was flipping through his phone contacts. He said that not only the teacher was unavailable, but also everyone else, after which he assumed that there was still no signal. Dasam looked thoughtfully at her feet. She said that if it was due to necromancy, then it was not only strange that there was no connection. The girl added that the further they plunge into the secret, the more something is trying to stop them. Sua was sitting nearby. Sehim noticed her first. She was still crying, and Dolly was standing behind her. Sua was glad that the guys were alive. Dolly greeted. They stood opposite the girls. Dolly said that she called for help at the request of the headman. Jun asked if it was true. The girl smiled while talking to the guys. She confirmed, and then suggested that there was something urgent. Dasam stood next to Sua. Dolly said that from the words of the headman she did not understand what had happened, and asked if the heroes had figured out everything. The girl put on her beret. Dasam looked at her friend and replied that thanks to her they came quickly. Dolly continued to smile and said that she was glad that everything was resolved. Yoon and June got angry. The girl asked what was resolved here. She clenched her fists and began to shout that the reality of necromancy was being lost before the guy's eyes, and even insects were supposed to be proof of this. Yoon pointed her finger at Dasam and Sehim and asked if they had photos or anything. Dasam thought about the photo. She looked at Yoon and said that a hotel employee stopped her. Dolly asked what they were all talking about. She held her hands behind her back and asked about what necromancy and what evidence they were talking about. The smile disappeared from her face and she asked if the characters had watched the horror movies and asked if everything was okay with them. Banhyang Hospital. A policeman stops an angry physical teacher. He demands to be let in and says that he will go to the guys himself and check everything. The policeman tells him to calm down. Dongchul and Pagon stood behind Hajin, who was waving his arms and shouting. He said that he understood everything and demanded to be released. The man will answer that the teacher should not behave this way. The police officer held the physical teacher with both hands, and he tried to break free and shouted that as a teacher he could not talk to his students. He was asked to stop. Hajin pounded the policeman on the back and shouted that his students might be in danger, and then again demanded to be let in. The second policeman stood leaning against the official car. He told Hajin to be taken to Sergeant Kim. The holder asked again. The teacher broke out of the grip, which the policeman himself stopped, and shouted that he could let him go already. He shouted to his companions to go. The policeman raised his hand. The man put his hand in front of the teacher and said that the students should be left here, since he still had to receive a certificate of entry into the restricted area. The character glowed red at Dongchul. The guy leaned forward. The policeman told Hajin to go alone, and he asked what would happen if he refused. The man looked angrily at the teacher and asked if he meant that he would refuse to cooperate with the investigation, and then said that then he would have to go with him on the case of obstruction of official duties. Red energy engulfed Dongchul. The guy fell to his knees. The nurse asked how he was. Hajin ran to his student and asked what was wrong with him. Dongchul did not react to those around him and drool began to flow from his mouth. The physical education teacher told him to get up and asked what was wrong with him. Hajin got angry. The doctors began to whisper to each other. One of them said that the student was in such a situation, and the teacher wanted to forcibly take him out of the hospital. The men looked at Hajin disapprovingly. Someone was outraged by what kind of teacher this was, and someone said that the world had gone crazy. The physical education teacher looked at the nurse and addressed her. Pagon sat next to the student and asked what Hajin wanted. He asked her to take care of the guy. She looked at the man. The man looked at her. Hajin walked towards the police officer. He approached him. The teacher passed the policeman, who smiled slyly. The physical education teacher was standing at the bus stop. He waved to a passing bus. He ran after him and knocked on the door, asking where the transport was going and not taking him. Hajin looked after the bus and did not believe that it was refusing a passenger. The policeman turned to the teacher from the car window and suggested that he knew nothing about this island. He looked at the teacher with a crazy smile and said that on the island buses stop running earlier, and it's difficult to catch a car today. The man suggested that the physical education teacher stay in the hospital. Hajin looked at the speaker with suspicion. He turned away from the car and said that he would sort it out. A look of rage appeared on the policeman's face and he asked what the man could know, since he was not even an expert. He said that they, who are not islanders, don't even show respect when their elders talk to them. Hajung still had his back to him. He thanked the man for everything. He turned to him with an angry face and shouted that the teacher needed to check if everything was okay with his students, since this was his responsibility and power of attorney. The teacher set off on foot and told him to either take him to Seiko or not to interfere. There was a terrible fog outside. Hajin decided that if he didn't get a car, he would walk. The heroes were still talking outside the hotel. Dasam said it was hard to believe everything that happened to them. She looked at her phone and said that she wanted to leave a photo as proof, but they were hastily kicked out. Min put her hand on her shoulder and looked up. She said that these people were clearly in a hurry to get somewhere. June put his hand on the neck and asked about their haste. Yoon replied that it was true and they clearly had their reasons for it. The girl looked with a tired look and suggested that if these people are connected with necromancy, and since these people are getting stronger, their task is to quickly return the dead. Dolly looked at Yoon and asked if she really believed in necromancy. The girl replied that yes and asked if her friend had seen their pale faces and empty gaze. She remembered Youngwoo and Minwon lying on the floor. Yoon added that at the same time their bodies twisted in every possible way, but they could not say anything. An image of Minwon's attacker appeared in her head. The girl added that they could only scream strangely in a way that a person could not. She looked to the side and said that the insects that crawled out of their bodies were more important. Dasam raised her fist with a serious face and said that she knows it's hard to believe, but there is something here that they don't understand. Dolly looked at her friend, who stood with her back to her, and decided to figure it out. She said that the hotel workers revived a gang of hooligans using necromancy, and then they attacked them. Sehim spread his hands and said that everything was correct and added that it didn't matter what it was, but they were obliged to inform the teachers. Nin looked towards June. The guy asked if the hotel staff would contact the teachers. The girl replied that it was so. Dolly looked at her feet and said that she didn't even know. She raised her head and said that she felt like the guys were focusing a little on the wrong things and asked if Juwon's injury was a priority right now. The girl put out her hand. June thought about it. Dolly asked what could be more important to hotel staff than the safety of guests. The boy said that was true. Min tilted her head in irritation and crossed her arms. Jun replied that, of course, helping their friend was a priority. Min said that it was an exaggeration that the jerks and the hotel workers were somehow related to each other. Dasim looked at them. The blonde scratched the back of her head and invited her friend to stop and wait. Dasim asked and did not understand what was being said. She replied that she was talking about the symbol. Sua looked excitedly at the speakers. Jun approached Dasim and said that if not for the symbol, they would have been safe, and then turned to Yoon and asked if she wanted to go together to look for evidence of necromancy. She jumped back in fear and said that she wouldn't go alone if the guys refused, because she was worried about her life. Min looked at Dasim and said that everyone was worried, after which she offered to sit out until they contacted the teachers. Dasim and Sehim looked down, but agreed with the blonde's proposal. Dolly clapped her hands and said that now they would just lay low until everything was settled and would not anger the teachers, and then she explained that she meant not to do anything like that. The hero looked at her with slight irritation. The joyful girl turned to the headman and said to go upstairs and tell everyone else about it. Sua was still worried. She agreed. Suddenly the hero said to stop. Dolly looked questioningly at Sehim. He asked since when were girls such good girls. Dasim looked at the guy. The hero began to talk about evidence. He looked at Dolly and asked if they had any proof. The girl looked at him and said that there must be evidence to go and put friends in danger. Sehim reached into his belt to take out his dagger and said that Dolly says that they can avoid danger, but she is wrong and they are already in danger. The girl's eyes reflected a dagger with a purple glow. The guy was holding a weapon in his hands. He said that they were in danger as well as Kaijong, who was going to kill Dongchial. Dolly looked at the blade. She raised her finger and asked where the hero got it from. The hero replied that Kijon was going to use him to kill him. The girl continued to look at the murder weapon. She couldn't believe that a boy could bring this to the island. Sehim looked at the glowing dagger. He said that their classmate did not bring it with him because the blade was on the island. Dolly asked what he was talking about. A bright red glow was visible from afar. The girl asked the hero if he wanted to say that someone from this island is using Kijon and the hooligans for their own purposes. Rain engulfed the island. Kaijong was thinking about how everyone said that school trips were the best things about school years. He knew it. The guy remembered how Dongchul beat him. The boy was sure that this excursion was supposed to be fun. The young man did not understand why he felt so terrible. The guy opened his mouth in pain. Kijong recalled that after what the Dongchial boys did to him, he did not feel like a human being. Kijong falls down screaming. He talked about what he was like to bullies and suggested that his role was a punching bag. Dongchul looked at the guy with an evil smile. He told him to get up. Kijong thought that he might have been offended for the sake of spectacle. One of the hooligans asked the one who was looking at them if he saw something interesting. The school children moved on. The young man thought it was good that it was not him. He asked people if they used it as an amulet, thinking that, but he couldn't know. The boy looked at his reflection in the puddle. He thought that even understanding this, whether he was worth something or was he an empty place. Tears appeared in the schoolboy's eyes. He understood that there was not a single person who could worry about someone like him. Dongchul heard Dasim calling out to Sehim. The guy had a phone in his hands, filming what was happening. Kaijong and Dongchial looked at the hero. The bully swore. The guy threw his victim into a puddle. The leader of the hooligans looked angrily at his comrades and told them to follow him, since Jang Sehim had photographed them and was going to report them. The trio went further, insulting the guy and talking about how dare he was and that he needed to be taught a lesson. Kijong looked after him, sitting in a puddle. The boy sat thinking. He realized that he was wrong. He picked up the stone. Dongchul was talking to his friends, and Kaijong realized that now there was a person who was thinking about him. The boy picked up the stone and in his thoughts asked not to touch the hero. He looked at something in surprise. There was a dagger lying next to the guy. It was stuck in the ground and asked Kijong to take it. The boy looked at him in fear. The voice told him not to be scared and he seized the weapon because he has the right. The same octopus eye appeared in the puddle. He called the schoolboy his child and demanded that the bridle be cut for his sake. The hotel was engulfed in rain. Room 205. Kijong was indignant. The boy clenched his fists and looked in the mirror. He asked the eye why it appeared again. The guy looked at him with a frightened look. He asked if he was some kind of god and if he could save him. Kijong looked at the floor in frustration. He said that if the eye had only told him when Sehim stole the dagger, then everything would have been different. He looked at the mirror again and began repeating what if he had a dagger. The eye looked at the guy through the mirror and said that the blade had returned to its place. The guy was surprised. He looked at the mirror and asked what the voice meant. He replied that his child had nothing to scold himself for. The eye looked at the guy and the voice said that he just needed to return him to his place. Kijong grabbed the mirror and began to shake it. He asked what this meant and recalled that the voice said that only the chosen one could cut the bridle. The guy continued to shake the mirror and shout at him. He asked how he would do this if he did not have a dagger. The boy came to a realization. Insight was visible in his eyes. He began to understand that it was not him who was chosen, but Sekhem. A hero appeared in the reflection in front of him. Sehim's reflection looked at the guy. He remembered hiding the blade behind his back when they first arrived. The boy had memories in his head of how he hid his weapon with fear. He listed that he received the blade, he hid it. He believed that everything he did and the role he received should be his. Kijong put his hands on the floor and looked down. Tears dripped onto the floor. Many tears came from his eyes. The boy did not understand what he was worth if he did not get the desired role. A voice called to him. Tentacles came out of the mirror. The voice asked the child why he was so sad. The tentacles approached the guy and a voice told him to raise his head. Tentacles covered Kijong's body and a voice said that the end of the world was coming. Tentacles wrapped around the student's leg. The voice said that if the bridle disappeared, it would return. Many eyes looked out of the mirror while the tentacles came out from there. The voice said to be more cheerful because fate is determined. Kijong stood on his feet as the tentacles lifted him up. The voice declared that the guy's destiny was to see his second coming with his own eyes. Lightning flashed over the hotel. Water came from the tap. Sehim stood in the bathroom in front of the mirror. He looked at the sink. The water went down the drain. Dolly was holding a cup of tea in her hand. She sat in front of the guys with a towel around her neck. The girl asked if they were talking about there being something here that could bring the dead back to life, planning a mass murder. Min was wiping her head, and Yoon was holding a cup of tea. The girl with glasses said that everything is so and it is called necromancy. The blonde said that they were just specifically hooked on it. Min looked at Dasam. The girl looked into the cup. The friend said that it was Dasam who insisted on this. Dolly looked at her silently. The girl's cup was on the table and she said that she did not care who insisted on this and she was not trying to blame, saying that someone here had gone crazy. She looked at her cup and talked about what was interesting to her. The girl closed her eyes and said to assume that there was someone on the island who was planning a mass murder. Dasam looked at her friend, and she asked if there was a way to find out who planned this. She added that they cannot know whether the teachers will believe them, but go looking and go straight to their death. Dasam looked down nervously. Sehim entered the room and everyone looked at him. He said there was a way to find whoever wanted to plot. Dasam joyfully called the guy by name. The hero put on his yellow hat. Jun asked if the hero said that there was a way. The hero's eyes lit up purple and he said that he would ask Kijong personally. Everyone looked at Sehim, who said that he would find out about the instigator of the conspiracy from Kijong directly. The hero looked at Jun. He asked about his intentions. Sua wanted to object. The girl looked at the hero and said that Kijong is now in the isolation ward. Sekhem looked at the headman and remained thoughtfully silent. She said that now that the teachers don't believe them, the guys won't even be able to find out from them where the guy is being kept. Jun leaned back on the sofa and closed his eyes. He asked what they could do then if they didn't even know where Kijong was. Yoon looked at him and asked what was so difficult about it. She said they could just watch the hotel staff. Min spit out all the tea and scared Yoon. The blonde looked at her in fear and asked how she could talk about this so carelessly. Dasam folded her hands and rejected this option. She looked at the hero and suggested that there were other options. The hero looked at her and was about to say something. He was stopped by Dolly, who extended her hand. She sat with her legs crossed. The girl suggested looking at the situation from a different angle. She put her hand to her chin and leaned down. The girl said it didn't matter what the boys did as long as they did it recklessly. The girls on the opposite couch slumped. Dolly said that Lee Kaijong tried to commit murder, and this is a very serious accusation, and even if the heroes find out where he got this knife from, there is no guarantee that he will give them the true answer. The girl continued speaking without looking at the others. She stated that the person who conspired with him is still unknown and if their guesses are correct, they will not be able to prevent situations like with Juwon. Jun jumped away from Dasam in fear. Sekhem went out and Dolly told him that rushing in such a situation was too risky. The guy turned around and said that he was sure that the girl was not mistaken, so everyone should wait for him here. Dolly fell silent and lowered her head. The guy turned away, but Dolly asked him what he was going to do. He turned his head and said that before the killer breaks into this room, someone must do it. The girl looked at him. She stood up and called the hero by name. She put out her hand and started talking. Dolly demanded that he stop being a hero, as it could be very dangerous. He looked at her and asked why this was happening. Dasam looked at him silently. Dolly told him to go to the canteen as dinner time was approaching and now there was a high chance that the hotel staff were keeping an eye on everything. Everyone looked at the girl. She said that if he was going to risk his life, then he should at least think with his head before going. Seham looked at Dolly angrily. The lamps were burning on the chandeliers. The dining room was empty. The hero looked out from behind the wall. He stood behind the wall and thought that when he came out, not a sound was heard. The guy sat down on his knee and thought why he was worried. On the contrary, he was glad that he did not see the employees. Seham did not have time to finish his thought, as someone's finger poked him in the back. He got scared, fell to the floor and screamed. Dasam stood in front of him. She asked why he shouted and called him crazy. The girl looked at him with a smile on her face and asked if the hero was pretending to be a hero again. Jun and Sua appeared behind the heroine. June said that the lovebirds were fooling around and said. The friend extended his hand to the hero. He didn't have time to ask how they got here. June raised his comrade with one hand and said that he need not thank them. They looked at the hero and the guy said that the three of them came here to protect the hero. The shoes walked down the corridor. Everyone turned around. Someone's shadow appeared in the passage. The shadow grew larger. A hotel employee and a cook were walking down the corridor with a tray. They were approaching the guys. Sekim stood with a frightened face. The woman was serious. Her feet continued to walk along the corridors. The hero was still standing around the corner, waiting for something. The others stood behind him. Sweat appeared on the guy's face. The employee turned her head towards the passage in which the hero stood. She went out to the kitchen. A man with a beard stood behind her. He looked at her and said that the Yellow Empress was waiting. The woman turned to him and he told her not to stop. The trio walked through the dining room. Children were hiding under tables. The woman walked near the table under which Sekim was hiding. She stopped right in front of the hero, who could see her legs. Sweat flowed from his head. The guy covered his mouth with his hand. She sat down in front of the table. There was horror in the hero's eyes. The woman pressed a small button on the floor. Seham continued to sit under the table with his eyes closed. He opened one eye. 3 people stood and looked at something. In front of them was a descent from which a green light came out. Dasam illuminated the tunnel with her phone flashlight. The heroes walked through the tunnel and June asked who would have thought that under their feet there would be a huge underground cache in a hotel on a remote island. Sua looked around with fear. She said it was hard to even imagine that something like this could exist. Sua remembered how she stopped the guy leaving. They looked at each other and June said that now he was so immersed in this atmosphere. Seham stopped everyone with a gesture. Sua said that it was so wet and humid in here, as if they were in an aquarium. Sekim said that there is a dead end here. The heroes looked at the passage blocked by tapes. Sua asked if it said that access was prohibited. June didn't believe it and asked where the employees were going down then, and then added that nothing could be done and offered to return. The heroes peered into the space behind the ribbons. The hero began to tear off the ribbons and said that if they follow this road, they will get to Kaijon. June looked questioningly at his friend and asked why he was so sure of this. The hero turned around and replied that there was no other way here, and if they wanted to return, they could do so at any time. Sua clenched her hands in fear, and Jun looked ahead in confusion. The girl began to turn her head and ask what they should do since these people were there. Seham and Dasam walked and inspected the place, and Sua and Jun ran after them. The boy said that he understood and heard the heroes, so they would go together. The hero noticed that he had stepped on a wooden floor. The heroes hid from the employees. The woman had a key in her hands. Sekim saw that the woman was opening the door. The boy realized that there was the place where Kijon was being kept. He continued to watch. The woman opened the door with a key. The hero thought that the employee, fortunately, had separated from the rest of the group, which meant that they had a numerical advantage. The woman opened the door. Sekim told himself not to be afraid. The employee turned around sharply. The guy quietly hid behind the wall. He sat looking frightened. The hero told himself that there was no need to be afraid and they only needed to rescue Kijon. Sekim stood near the stairs. He suggested that the stairs led to the old hotel building and should be approached carefully. Jun agreed that he needed to be careful since it was a staircase. The hero looked out slightly and said to stop. The guy pointed his finger up. Jun asked why Sehim was scaring them. The boy replied that the employees were nearby. He turned to his friends and said that they were up there. The hero climbed out of the hatch and looked at the hotel employees. The bald man replied that this was where they parted ways and said that no one knew what might happen if the Yellow Queen was kept waiting. He gave the key to room 202. The man extended his hand with the key to his partner and ordered him to be taken out as soon as possible. The employee took the cook by the shoulder and said he would go first. Sehim watched this excitedly. The door to room 202 was open. The guy looked at it and didn't understand when he managed to disappear. Everyone was sitting behind the hero, and he did not understand where he had gone when the boy looked away for only a second. Jun turned to Sua in fear. She asked if the guy heard anything suspicious. He asked where. The girl turned and pointed. She said from above. The guy sat in horror looking at the girl. Dasim closed her mouth in horror. Sua asked what was going on with them. Her eyes turned red and she asked someone to tell her what was happening. The girl's neck began to tear and a hotel employee stood nearby. The woman stood in front of the children. She went to them and asked if they were upset. The employee ran her hand over her face and said that it was not the same guy, and then a strange feeling took over her. She said she couldn't be wrong. Something began to happen to Das's hand. She winced in pain. The girl's face frowned. The woman stood over the heroine and said that she had found a brand. She grabbed Dasim by the throat and asked if they thought she didn't know. There was a crazy smile on her face. The employee said it was funny to watch Dasim struggle to survive, but the stigma didn't play a big role. The girl tried to escape, and the woman said that even if she continued to resist, he would kill her at dawn. She looked at the heroine angrily and asked if the girl cared about this, and then asked her to die for fun. A tentacle from Dasim's hand pierced the woman's head. The tentacle pushed away from the bloody face. Sehim was behind Das and was calling her. The guy approached her and asked if she was okay. June looked at this in horror. He opened his mouth and did not understand what he was seeing. The boy ran away from the heroes, shouting that they were crazy. The employee's hand transformed. The hand pierced the guy's chest. Sehim and Dasim watched as the woman killed June. The guy looked into the darkness. He thought that Jun and Sua were killed without any purpose. There was an awareness of horror on his face. The hero realized that this was not a murder plot, but a mistake that went beyond the limits of human thinking. The woman was approaching them. A red creature was bursting out of the woman's head. Sehim realized that this was just a disaster. Someone's foot appeared behind the heroes. The hero did not understand what he had done. He closed his eyes, accepting that this was the end. Blood dripped onto the guy's leg. He felt it flowing down his back. The guy turned around and saw that a dagger was stuck in his back. Kijon stood behind the guy. Sehim looked in horror at the guy who stuck the knife in his back. The young man asked to shed his blood for him. Sehim looked at Kijon, who asked to shed blood for his sake. There was shock on the hero's face. Kijong looked at his classmate with a crazy smile. The guy's pupil was bifurcated, like an octopus's. Hero realized that this was not the one he knew. The employee looked at the boys and started talking about the dagger. The monster's mouth was wide open and he asked where the children got the dagger. Kijong raised his hand. He looked at the monster and addressed him. He said that before him was the adopted daughter of the proud Byakuya, an indescribably loyal servant. The guy assumed that now she was just an abomination. The monster opened its mouth even more and ordered the boy to be silent. Calling him a non-entity, the creature asked the guy's name. Kijong looked ahead with crazy eyes. He called himself the tip of the tongue that indulges death. He walked towards the monster and said that he was the lips praising glory, and he would devour the world. Sekhem looked at the leaving guy in horror. He kept saying strange things. He said he would chew and spit out and he is a ding. The guy stuck out his long tongue and identified himself as the one giving the orders. He stretched out his hands and said that he was the throat of God. The hero looked at Kijon. Sehim remembered what kind of deja vu visited him when he saw him. He looked closely at the guy's eyes. The young man remembered the vessel he had looked into in class. He remembered the strangely shining yellow eye that he had seen in the darkness of this vessel. The employee kept her hands on her sides. She laughed at Kijon calling himself the throat of God. Sehim sat in horror and Dasim sat next to him. The monster told Kijon that judging by the way he was ranting, he was just a non-entity who was branded. The monster said that for sin, without knowing it, he would sacrifice the heroes and the blade to the yellow goddess. The employee pulled out a hand with sharp claws. Something started to come out of Kaijong's mouth. Sekhem looked at this with fear and disgust. He realized that then in the forest he had to pretend that he did not see the guy. He remembered that he lived normally and did not understand why exactly then all this happened. Insight appeared in the guy's eyes. It became clear to him that it all started in that forest, and because he went where he shouldn't have, everyone died. Dasim fell on the hero's shoulder. He looked at her. The girl tried to say something. Sehim was devastated. He didn't understand what he was thinking about and realized that even Kim Dasim almost died because of him. The guy clenched his bloody fist. He hit himself and told himself to pull himself together. Sekhem put his girlfriend on his back and thought that now only escape would save them. The employee was busy with Kijon and the hero realized that this was an opportunity, since the monsters were fixated on each other. Kijon looked away. The monster from his mouth went after the heroes. Sehim turned around. The green creature devoured the boy. He didn't know if he was dead because he was swallowed up by something. It seemed to him that the world after death was very cold. He lay among the stars and it seemed to him that he was immersed in water. Sehim opened his eyes. He squinted and didn't know if he could see the light. His eye opened completely. The yellow eye looked at him and said that they had not seen each other for a long time. Sehim hovered in front of the eye with huge tentacles. He bowed his head and said that he understood everything now. He realized that this was what was in the cafe. Something was planned by it. Sehim clenched his fist, and the eye continued to look at him. Something is responsible for killing Jun and Suer right in front of their eyes, and it also used Kaijong for the murder. The eye looked at him. The voice said that all this was just a vision of the hero. Sehim got angry and started screaming. He asked why all this. He stood and shouted, spreading his arms to the sides. The hero asked why something did this to them and why them. He remembered his fallen comrades and said that they all died without even knowing the reason. The boy began to wipe tears from his eyes. The hero did not look at the creature. The voice told its child not to be sad, and then said that he was not here to help him. The tentacle engulfed the hero and the voice said that because of the one who hurt the guy, something has lost its body and is in pain. Sehim looked at him and asked what he was talking about. The voice said that as long as the Yellow Empress exists, moans are as meaningless as an echo in the void. The tentacle brought the hero closer to him and the voice said that this man had put them in a bind and they were in constant pain. The voice promised to take away all the pain, but the hero must show him his faith. Sehim looked at the eye with fear and said that Kijon spoke about the bridal before he went crazy. He demanded to know in more detail who the statement was about. Something began to appear behind the hero. The voice said to watch. Something created the silhouette of a priestess and said that she was the Yellow Empress or Red Saint. The planets are lined up in a row in front of the sun. From the beginning the skies were equal. When the fateful hour arrived, the Yellow Empress entity was to lead the ceremony of the event, allowing the entity to appear as the liberator of all from pain and all the stigmatized who shared his flesh. The priestess began to eat the flesh. Something said that she had taken over his flesh and gained all the power it had. Because of her greed, she became blind in both eyes and went astray. A stream of blood sprayed from the priestess. The creature said that she was no longer devoted to him. The hero was covered in blood. Now the creature follows its faith and punishes heretics, as well as those who are devoted to the faith of the Yellow Empress. The yellow eye looked at the hero. The voice said that his child's duty was important until his flesh was fully harvested. Sehim wiped the blood from his face. Something said that when it calls a hero, he must follow the faith, and in this case everyone in the world will know Sehim as his incarnation. The hero looked blankly. Something said that it was sure that the world would see it, and it would help the guy not go astray. It demanded no doubt, since the suffering world was waiting for a savior. The boy continued to look ahead blankly. Something ordered me to open my eyes, return and start with death. Kaijong spat out Sehim. The employee towered over the hero and laughed. She said that fratricide in such a situation is behavior worthy of insignificance. The hero stood up, and the monster jumped on him, demanding to expose his neck. The monster's mouth stopped when she was called Seal's traitor. God said she was a traitor, following the wrong god. God looked at her through the hero and ordered her to look at him and hold his heart. He said that the hero returned after death, and as his representative the images of a dagger, an eye and a heart arose. God said that Sehim, as a being branded by him, has the right to judge those who turn away from him. Cthulhu stood behind the eye. He ordered the traitor to be caught and said that this was his punishment. Sehim's pupil began to bifurcate. Nurse Pagan looked at Dong Chiol. She asked if he had come to his senses. The guy sat up on the bed. The shoulder strap asked if he was okay and explained that he suddenly lost consciousness. The bully asked where the class teacher was. The girl lowered her gaze and remained silent, and then said that he went to look for the scene of the incident. Doctors walked along the corridors of the hospital. The guy asked if the teacher went alone. Dong Chul winced in pain. He held his hand to his head. The nurse asked if he was dizzy and if he needed to buy him something from the buffet. The doctor entered the room and asked if the man had left the island. Pagan responded positively. The doctor said there is no buffet here. Dong Chul looked from behind his fingers at the woman and asked if there were any other hospitals on the island. The nurse looked at the guy, and the doctor replied that there was no such large hospital. The guy tore the catheter out of his hand. He got up and went somewhere. The nurse shouted after him. She asked where he was going. Dong Chul bit his lip. He thought that there was obviously someone here who could confirm what had happened. Signs with the names of offices flashed near the guy. He was approaching the right place. The guy saw the ward. In the ward, someone's hand was hanging from the bed. Police in raincoats surrounded the man. The man shouted at them. The old man in the blue raincoat apologized and called Comrade B to come with him. The policeman called the old man. He turned around. The employee looked with his scary gaze and said that the old man should not cover for him too much, since he knows that they are friends. The policeman said he lost a sacred relic, and now this too. Drool flowed from the drunkard's mouth. The man explained that if that guy had not been from the island, he would have been abandoned long ago. Therefore, the policeman asked the old man not to say anything for which he would later be criticized. The old man looked at his comrade. The policeman approached the man, and the old man offered to explain everything again. The man refused. The old man clenched his fist when he heard the policeman convey the words of the priest that the man would be disposed of. The police officer said to take Tokbi to the monastery and let him remain in his dreams. The old man looked at this with regret. The car was driving along the highway. The old man was lighting a cigarette. He looked at B, who woke up and began to curse the island. The old man was blowing smoke. He asked the man if he was going to get drunk and die, and then said that he thought B would talk about his village. The comrade silently looked out the window. He turned to the old man and asked if the pseudo-priest had said that he would kill him. The driver was indignant. He put out his cigarette and said, "Don't say that." In the reflection of the mirror one could see the edge of the old man's face. He said that he was really worried and as a friend he should at least say something. B looked down sadly. The old man demanded to let go of the family he left behind and come to his senses, and then asked if B needed to come to his senses. He asked how long his friend would act like crazy. The man covered his face with his hands and asked if he was crazy. B asked how not to be crazy. He remembered his wife's funeral. For 17 years he supported his wife, who lost her mind from a miscarriage. But even with such a wife, he endured it. Someone approached the grieving man. When his wife's condition worsened, she joined a sect. Due to continued refusal of treatment, she had reached the point of no return. Someone put a hand on the man's shoulder and he turned around. He said that if you're not crazy in a situation like that, it's crazier. At that moment, the people from the island, whom he considered family, came and began to say something to him. God's plan. The one who put his hand on the man's shoulder was the same police officer. The man asked about his wife's support and attempt to believe, as well as about the revival of his dead wife, and the gratitude of citizens for what they say. He felt like the sky had abandoned him. There were remnants of tears in the man's eyes. B said that the so-called God is when a person lives a painful life and asked how not to go crazy. Anger settled in the man's eyes. When he thought about this, he wanted to look into the face of God and bite him. Rain dripped onto B's hand. He said there are other real worms. He stated that he eventually met the sea god they were talking about. The old man looked at his friend and asked what he was talking about. The driver held the steering wheel, but did not look at the road. He said that his friend was really sick. He remembered the morning his wife died. She set the table. The man came out to her while she was cooking. It was then 17 years since the death of their child. He couldn't believe what she was doing. They sat at the table opposite each other. The wife had an unknown container with precious stones. The wife was talking at the table. Most of all, B couldn't believe what she said. She said that she would go to Edragon's cave to meet her sea god. Saying this, she handed him the nectar. He considered this nonsense, because she said something that was impossible to believe. The man was sitting alone with a cigarette. He said that he put this strange rubbish in a corner. He looked at the vessel with nectar. At that moment, he did not know that he was seeing his wife for the last time. Remembering his wife in order to calm down the anger of not knowing where to go now, B plunged into drink. The man was drinking alcohol. When there was no alcohol at home, he poured nectar into a glass and drank it in one gulp. A yellow eye appeared in front of him. Through a yellow eye with a horizontal slit, he was able to see the whole truth. His wife did not have a miscarriage. People in robes lined up in front of the building. 18 years ago, before giving birth, his wife was told that the body of the born child would belong to one of the 10 high priests. A man on a ship arrived to his wife and child. She secretly arranged for the child to be adopted by someone outside the island. Lee considered this nonsense, but the high priests were also confused. When there was not enough strength, their balance was also disrupted. The Red Saint stood on a mountain of corpses. She found a loophole in this and was able to take away all the power from the other high priests. One of the high priests rebelled at the behest of the priestess. The Red Saint, who put all the power into one vessel, was not safe, so she borrowed the power of a god to resurrect the high priest with the most powerful cup through necromancy. She made him a puppet and shared his power to secure her own vessel. The vessels with the symbol stood next to each other. The priestess left the remaining power in a clay vessel. He asked the old man to remember what happened in 2000. The man looked at the driver and said that there was a parade of planets then, but no sea god was seen, because people had betrayed God. The old man looked questioningly at his interlocutor. Bones and skulls fell into the abyss. B said that in order to keep the sea god in a state of eternal sleep, more souls had to be sacrificed than before, and there were not enough inhabitants of the island. The city is illuminated by sunlight. The priestess looked beyond the island, and then a large-scale tourism project began to attract tourists, who became victims. The man was counting money in his hands. Thanks to tourism, income increased and the islanders began to blindly follow the priestess more. The old man looked angrily at his comrade and said that this was nonsense. V grinned and asked if it was scary. He asked if what the old man believed was right or if it was all wrong. There was a smile on the man's face. He continued to say that any truth is not important, but what is truly important is the evil on this island. The old man did not take his eyes off B and remembered the relic and asked if the man meant that he had lost this particular thing. He replied yes. The ritual blade and the sealed vessel were nearby. B chewed his fingers. He repeated the name of the relics. He looked forward madly and said that this was not enough. The man added that due to the disappearance of this island, he would have to again ask the priest to help prepare the sacrifice. The car continued to drive through the rain. B said that before the parade of planets, another vessel was needed and his wife sharpened the blade next to them until she died, in order to take revenge on the sect and to erase all the evil from this island. The car was racing along the road. A strong storm began at sea.